Chapter 18 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 18. On Godfrey's transference from Godalming, Balthazar, with characteristic suddenness, moved into a furnished house in London. The reasons for his sojourn at the inn existed no longer. Besides, books and other belongings were quickly usurping the cubic space at his disposal. Marcel, urgently invited to a consultation, advised, according to her practical mind, a flat or a small house which he could furnish for himself, and she offered such aid as her duties would allow. He ruled out her suggestion. There must be rooms for Godfrey and Quong Ho whenever they should be in town, rooms for servants, decent living rooms, so that the inhabitants should not have to herd higgledy-piggledy together, also ample accommodation for Marcel, should she care to change her mind. Nothing but a large house would suit him. As for waiting until painters, decorators, paper-hangers, curtain-makers, carpet-layers, electric light-fitters, and such-like war-attenuated tribes had completed their business, it was out of the question. It would take months. He wanted to establish himself in a ready-made home right now, and get on with the war. Such a home his friend Mrs. Jackman had suggested. The owner, poor fellow, killed in the war, the wife and a boy of 13 left ill-provided for. As she could not afford to live in the house, and yet shrank from selling it and its precious contents, the boy's heritage, she would be content to let it furnished for an indefinite period. There it was, Sussex Gardens, near the park, admirable in every way. He was accustomed to spacious habitations. His house in Chenchow covered nearly an acre. In his exile at Spendale Farm he had room to breathe. The Godalming Inn was charming in its way, but now and then he had mad impulses to attack the walls of his sitting-room with his nails and tear them down. What was wrong with Sussex Gardens? It's extravagant, trouble-shirking, and generally manlike. Marry me, said he, and you shall have a house economical, trouble-inviting, and generally womanlike. Any kind of old house you consider ideal. You'll want 4 or 5 servants to run it, she objected, ignoring his proposition. Where are you going to get them from in these war times? They're already there. A cook who'll act as a housekeeper. You'll be robbed right and left. Come and save me, said Balthazar. She laughed. I'm tempted to do so just out of pity for you. Pity won't do, my dear, said he. Then you must go your own way. I'm going it, said Balthazar. Perhaps you'll come to Sussex Gardens now and then to see Godfrey, possibly Quong Ho. I might even come to see John Balthazar, said Marcel. So Balthazar settled down in the big house and gave himself up to the infinite interests of war-racked London. The weeks and the months passed. Quong Ho at Cambridge, under the benign tutelage of Dr. Sheepshanks, began the study of Greek for his little go, and wrote to his patron curious impressions of the university. I have the option, said he, of taking up for this examination either an infant's primer on logic compiled by an illustrious thinker of a bygone age called Jevons, or a humorous work on the evidence of Christianity by the divine Paley, who seems to be one of the patriarchs of the Anglican Church. As the latter seems the more entertaining, seeing that it tends to destroy in the mind of the reasoning believer all faith in the historical truth of the Christian religion, I am studying it with a deep interest based on the analogy between English and Chinese academic conservatism. On the other hand, dear sir and most venerated master, if you could suggest a course in theology more in consonance with modern philosophical thought, I should derive from it much instruction and recreation. Balthazar bade him get on with his Greek, so that if he wanted light reading, he could soothe his leisure hours with Aristotle and Thucydides. I am working at Greek, like stags, wrote Quong Ho later, with all the more zeal because I find I have completed already the mathematical course required for my tripos. Some time afterwards he wrote again. If you, most honoured sir, would permit me, I should esteem it a privilege to read for the science tripos as well as the mathematical. I should enjoy the possibility of the application of my sound mathematical equipment to the higher branches of physics. Do what you like, my dear fellow, replied Balthazar. Suck the old place dry. Quong Ho delighted him. Sheepshanks wrote enthusiastically of the rare bird. He will be a monument, said he, to your sound and masterly teaching. I wish you would come back to us. But Balthazar had other things to do. Having set his house in order, established Quong Ho at Cambridge, seeing Godfrey accept his filial position and cemented relations, such as they were, with Marcel, he plunged headforemost into the war. Others floundered about in it, tired after 2 strenuous years of buffeting. He came to it fresh, with new zeal and unimpaired strength of mind and body. With a new keen judgment, too, being in the unique position of one with historical perspective. Others had lived through the fateful years and could not clear their brains of the myriad cross-currents that had swirled through them day by day, almost hour by hour, and had sympathized themselves into their mental being, so that with all their passionate patriotism they could not see the main course. Balthazar brought an untroubled and vigorous intellect to bear on an accurately studied situation. "We're all at 6s and 7s, cried Weatherly one day in despair, when they were discussing the new weekly review of the Far Eastern policy which he'd asked Balthazar to control. "Unless we're careful, the project will drop to pieces. Russell now declines to edit it unless we give him an autocratic hand. But Russell's mad on Slovenes and Ruthines and Croats. Clever as he is, he has no sense of proportion. I don't know what the devil we're going to do. There's no one else can give the time. For the review to be any good, a man must throw his whole soul into it." Balthazar had one of his flashes. "If you like, I'll edit the damn thing. You've all been fiddling about for a title. I've got one. The New Universe. I'll undertake to make a living thing of it, wipe out all the dreary, weary old weekly and monthly respectabilities. We won't have a second-rater writing for it. We'll appeal to Longleat Towers and Mendip's sunless caves. We'll make it the one thing that matters in this quill-driven country. We'll have it translated into all known languages and circulated over the civilized earth. It'll be the only publication that'll give everybody the truth about everything." He went on in his vehement way. When Weatherly asked him where the money for so gigantic a scheme was to come from, he quoted the Tichborne claimant. "Some has money and no brains, and some has brains and no money. If those with no money can't get money from those with no brains, God help them." And it came to pass, a few days afterwards, at a meeting of the committee of the new review, that Balthazar had his way. As he looked with even vision on Ruthines, Slovenes, Belgians, Hereros, Yugoslavs, British miners, Samoans, the staff of the Foreign Office, Indian princes, Mrs. Annie Besant, the denizens of Arkansas, the Southern Chinese, the gilded adorners of Newport, the Women's Emergency League, the Wilhelmstrasse, Armenians, and the Young Men's Christian Association, a fact elicited by a lengthy discussion of the multitudinous phases of world politics, and as he succeeded in convincing all the several zealots of particular interests that their impassioned aims were an integral part of his far-reaching scheme, they came unanimously to the conclusion that no one but he had the universality to edit the new universe, and passed a resolution promising him their loyal co-operation. "I'm going to make this darn thing hum," said Balthazar to Weatherly. Money was the first object. Brains he could command in plenty. He envisaged London as his El Dorado. The history of his exploitation of the capitalist and landowner would, if it were published, become a textbook on the science and remain forever a classics. He forced wealth-guarding doors of whose existence he had been ignorant 6 months before. By a stroke of genius which had brought him his position in China, he secured the support, financial and moral, without the control of an important group of newspapers. He enlisted the aid of every possible unit in his rapidly increasing circle of acquaintance. The scope of the weekly had extended far beyond the modest bounds of its conception. Originally it was to be an appeal to the thinkers of all nations. "Damn thinkers," said Balthazar. "They're as scarce as angels, and about as useful. We want to put thoughts into the heads of those that don't think. It's the doers we want to get hold of. A thing academic is a thing dead. This is going to live." Some of the superiors smiled at his enthusiasm, but Balthazar damned them and went his way. This was going to be the great teaching crusade of the war, the most far-sweeping instrument of propaganda known to journalism. He pulled all strings, brought in all parties. A high dignitary of the Labour world and a Tory duke of unimpeachable integrity found themselves appointed as trustees of the New Universe Publication Fund. Money flowed in. One day he ran across Piliphant in St. James's Street. Piliphant, mainly individualized by a sable fur coat and a lustrous silk hat, and a monstrous cigar cutting his red face like a 15-inch gun cutting the deck of a battleship. Balthazar greeted him as a long-lost brother, and hauled him off to lunch at his club. Mellowed by the club's famous Chambertin and 1870 port, he took a rosy view of all kinds of worlds, including the new universe, as presented by his host. It was a great scheme, he agreed. He was sick of all newspapers, no matter of what shades of opinion. They were all the same. Honesty was not in them, nor was there honesty in any government. Men with not a quarter of what he had done for the country to their credit were being rewarded with peerages and baronetcies. In the New Year's honours list he had not been mentioned, not even offered a beastly knighthood. It didn't matter. He was a patriot, and it was a very fine old brandy, and he didn't mind if he did have another glass. Still, if a man put down £1,000 for a thing, it was only business prudence to know where he stood. "You'll stand here," cried Balthazar, spreading before his eyes a printed list of the General Committee, a galaxy of dazzling names. "You'll take rank in the forefront of the biggest patriotic crusade that ever was. Your light will no longer be under a bushel, it will shine before men. What's the good of your name being lost in a close-printed subscription list? This is a totally different thing. Your appearance here will give you position. Look at the people. Have you ever stood in with a crowd like this before?" Balthazar held the mellow profiteer with his compelling eyes. I can't say that I have," replied Piliphant, but all the same—" "But all the same," Balthazar interrupted, "you've been at loggerheads with the War Office. There was that question asked in the House over the aerodrome contract. You told me all about it yourself. Now listen to me carefully." Balthazar played a gambler's card. "Your coming in with us will be a guarantee of integrity. It's obvious that no one on this list could be otherwise than run straight. The worry would save you." He looked at his watch and jumped up. "By George, I've got an appointment with our treasurer, Lord Belden. Would you like to come along and hear more about the scheme? Waiter, ask them to get me a taxi. We'll find our hats and coats round here." He drove a gratified Piliphant to Chesterfield Gardens and introduced him to Lord Belden, with whom he had no appointment whatever, as an enthusiastic believer in the new universe, ready to finance it to the extent of £2,000 or £3,000. 3,000, wasn't it? I said between 2,000 and 3,000, replied Piliphant, flattered at his reception by the powerful old peer, and not daring to fall back on the original 1,000 that had been vaguely suggested. A bluff, of course, for which he admired Balthazar, although he cursed him in his heart. Was it worth while calling it? He could buy up this old blighter of a lord twice over. He would show that he had the money. "I was thinking of 2,500, he continued. "But what's a miserable 500? Yes, you could put me down for 3,000. In fact," with a flourish he drew a cheque-book from his pocket, "I'll write you the cheque now, payable, I presume, to the Right Honourable the Earl of Belden. Or the New Universe, as you please." "Better be personal," said Piliphant, enjoying the inscription of the rolling title and the prospect of the elevated eyebrows of the bank clerk who should debit the sum to his account. "That's exceedingly generous of you, Mr. Piliphant," said Lord Belden, putting the cheque into a drawer of his writing-table. "Oh, just patriotic, your lordship," replied Piliphant, with a profiteering wave of the hand. "I think," said Balthazar, "that the contributor of such an important sum ought to be offered some practical interest in the scheme. Mr. Piliphant's name will appear on the General Committee, but that's more or less honorary. The sub-committees will do the real business. We're going to deal with every phase of the war, Piliphant, and the various sub-committees, their names will be published large as life and twice as natural, will supply the editorial department with indisputable facts. Now," he turned to Lord Belden, "if Mr. Piliphant will serve on the Purity of Contracts sub-committee, he'll be bringing us a tremendous and invaluable business experience." "That's a most happy suggestion," smiled Lord Belden. "Oh, I think so too. I'll get a run for my money," said Piliphant. When he had gone, Lord Belden turned a puzzled brow on Balthazar. "Isn't that the chap about whom some nasty things were said a few months ago?" Balthazar grinned. "It is," said he. "We made him disgorge some of his ill-gotten gains, and by putting him on the sub-committee we'll make him pretty careful about getting them ill in the future." Thus, with ruthless pertinacity, he gathered in a great sum of money, and finally, in a splendour of publicity, the first number of The New Universe appeared, and from the first day of its appearance Balthazar felt himself to be a power in the land. Another reputation in certain circles had meanwhile been made by his trenchant article on Chinese affairs in the Imperial Review. It led to an interview with the Chinese ambassador, who professed agreeable astonishment at finding the famous but somewhat mysterious Anglo-Chinaman of Chen Chao and the writer of the article one and the same person. After which he spent many pleasant hours at the embassy, discussing Chinese art and philosophy and the prospects of the career of his prodigious pupil, Quong Ho. In course of time, the Foreign Office discreetly beckoned to him. It had heard from authoritative sources, it smiled, that Mr. Baltazar's knowledge of China was unique, for though many other men were intimately acquainted with the country from the point of view of the official, the missionary, the merchant, and the traveller, it had never heard of a man of his attainments who had divorced himself from all European influence and had attained a high position in the social and political life of non-cosmopolitan China. If Mr. Baltazar would from time to time put his esoteric knowledge at the service of the Foreign Office would be grateful. At last, after various interviews with various high personages, for all this was not conveyed to him in a quarter of an hour, it not being the way of the Foreign Office to fall on a stranger's neck and open its heart to him, he received a proposal practically identical with Weatherly's suggestion, which he had so furiously flouted. The Secret Service, the Intelligence Department, had been crying out for years for a man like him, who should go among the Chinese as a Chinaman, thoroughly in their confidence. "A spy?" asked Balthazar bluntly. The Foreign Office smiled a bland smile and held out deprecating fingers. "Of course not. An agent, acting for the Allies, counteracting German influence, working in his own way, responsible to no one but the powers at Whitehall, but yet with necessary secrecy towards China's longed-for declaration of war against Germany." "China will come in on our side before the year's out," said Balthazar. How did he know it? Why, it was obvious to any student of the science of political forces. It was as supererogatory for a man to go out to China to persuade her to join the Allies as to stir up a bomb whose fuse was alight in order to make it explode. The Foreign Office protested against argument by analogy. The forthcoming entry of China into the war was naturally not hidden from its omniscience, but that did not lessen the vital need of secret and skilful propaganda before, during, and after the period that China might be at war. There were the eternal German ramifications to be watched, the possible Japanese influences. It spoke under the seal of the most absolute confidence, which, without any thought of disloyalty on the part of Japan, might not accord with Western interests. There were also the bewildering cross-currents of internal Chinese politics. There were thousands of phases of invaluable information which could not be viewed by the embassy, thousands of strings to be pulled which could not be pulled from Peking. We could not, like Germany and Austria in America, outrage those international principles upon which the ambassadorial system has been based for centuries. At the same time, "You're not above using a spy," said Balthazar. Again the Foreign Office deprecated the suggestion. It wouldn't dream of asking Mr. Baltazar to take such a position. "Then," said Balthazar, "what are you driving at?" The Foreign Office looked at him rather puzzled. As a matter of fact, it did not quite know. Having Balthazar's dossier pretty completely before it, it had gradually been compelled to the recognition of Balthazar as a man of supreme importance in Chinese affairs. He must be used somehow, but on the way to use him it was characteristically vague and hesitating. It knew a lot about the Ming dynasty, being a connoisseur in porcelain, but the Ming dynasty and all that it connoted had come to an end a devil of a long time ago, which was a pity, for it only knew the little about modern China which it gleaned from the epigrammatic and uninspired précis of official reports. To attach Balthazar in any way to the embassy was out of the question. The idea would have sent a shiver down its spine to the very last vertebra of the most ancient messenger whose father had run on devious errands for Lord Palmerston. On the other hand, Balthazar was not of the type which could be sent out on a secret errand. That fact he made almost brutally obvious. So, after looking at him for a puzzled second or two, it smiled invitingly. Really, it waited for him to make a proposition. This he did. "Offer me a square and above-board mission as the duly accredited agent of the British government, to perform whatever duties you prescribe for me, and I'll consider it. At any rate, I regard the offer as an honour. But to go back to my friends as Chi Wu Ting—" "Ah," interrupted the Foreign Office, turning over a page or two of typescript. "That's interesting. We wanted to ask you, how did you get that name in China? You started there, after your abandonment of your brilliant Cambridge career. You see, we know all about you, Mr. Baltazar, as James Burton." "Oh, phonetic," said Balthazar impatiently. "It's as impossible for an ordinary Chinaman to say James Burton as for you to pronounce a word with a Zulu click in it. It's the nearest they could get. It's good Chinese, so I adopted it. I'm known by it all through southern China. Let me get on with what I was saying. To go back to my friends as Chi Wu Ting and pretend I was acting in their interests, while all the time I was acting in the interests of the British government, well, I'm damned if I would entertain the idea for a second." The Foreign Office winced at the oath, although damned lustily in private. "But if Chi Wu Ting goes back, as you say, accredited?" "Oh, that's a different matter altogether. There's still the question of remuneration," said the Foreign Office. "I'm by way of being a rich man," said Balthazar. "I didn't spend the 18 golden years of my life in the interior of China for my health." The Foreign Office beamed. "That simplifies things enormously." "It generally does," replied Balthazar. A month later, the Foreign Office made him the offer which his sense of personal dignity demanded from them, and, honour being satisfied, he declined it. He could do better work for his country in London, said he, than in again burying himself alive for an indefinite number of years in China. The Foreign Office regretted his decision, but it gave him to understand that the offer would always remain open. They parted on terms of the most cordial politeness, but if the Foreign Office had heard the things Balthazar had said of it, its upstanding hair would have raised its own roof off. 3 months, he cried to Marcel, playing the fool, wasting their time and mine, when the whole thing could have been done in 5 minutes. But I can't quite see, she objected, why you went on when you made up your mind from the start not to go back to China. Can't you? Said he. I'll explain. I've sworn that there'll be no more idiocy on the part of John Balthazar to prevent him coming into his own. He is coming into it. That the F.O. should recognise his position was an essential factor of his own. When a man can dictate terms, he has established himself. See? I suppose, said he, halting in his abrupt way, and thrusting his hands deep in his trouser pockets, you think this is just childish vanity. Come on, say it. She met his bright eyes and smiled up at him. If I do, you won't bite my head off? No, I'll convince you that it isn't. Vanity, as its name implies, is emptiness. Negative. This isn't vanity. It's pride, something positive. My pet deadly sin. If you've got that strong, you can tell the 6 others to go back to hell. If I haven't got it, the others would have torn me to bits long ago. If I were a mongrel and thought myself a prize bull-pup, that would be vanity. But I know, hang it all, that I am a prize bull-pup. When I take leave to remind myself and people like the F.O. of the fact, that's pride. When I say I've sworn to fulfil the destiny of the prize pup John Balthazar and be one of the intellectual forces that will carry the empire along to victory, that's not vanity. Where's the emptiness? It's pride, reckoned first of the 7 deadly sins. If I glory in it, well, according to theologians, it's my damnation. According to me, it's the other way about. Look, there's another way of putting it. Suddenly, she was smitten with the memory of Godfrey's words 5 or 6 months ago, when he fumed at the bear leading of Quong Ho. Those infernal dancing eyes of his, and behind them something so pathetic and appealing. The boy was right. She met just that pathetic appeal. He was so anxious to put himself right with her. He went on. If I were in the habit of vying to perform impossible extravagances, that would be the sign of a vain man. But, apart from the acts of God, and I suppose technically we must classify the wiping out of my life's work under that heading, I've carried out every wildcat scheme I've deliberately set my mind to. So when I say I'm coming into John Balthazar's own, I know what I'm talking about, and that's the sign of a proud man. And, my dear, said he, after a pause, occupied in filling and lighting his pipe, I think this jolly old sin of mine keeps me from making an ass of myself in all sorts of other ways. Swiftly she applied these last words to the relations between them, and confessed their truth. A vain man would have pestered the life out of her, confident in attaining his ends as beautiful and spiritual as you please, until, through sheer weariness, she yielded, Such a one would enunciate and firmly believe in the proposition, she had not spent 20 years among men in angelic ignorance of their idiosyncrasies, that just hammer hard enough, and a woman will be bound to love you in the end. But there were others, with a deadly, sinful pride like Baltazar, who, scorning the vain, maintained the dignified attitude of the late lamented King Canute. He would not claim the impossible. But this was a far cry from the imperial government mission to the Far East. She asked, by way of escape from personal argument, "After all, this Chinese proposition is a first-rate thing. Is it so very repugnant to you to go back?" He stood over her with his clenched fists in the air. "My dear," said he, "you talked last year some silly rot about a locust. I know the beast better than you do. It had all those precious years I spent in that infernal country, the best years of my life. I'm starting now at 51, where I ought to have started at 30. That damned Chinese locust has robbed me of everything. You, Godfrey, the vital life of England, and a brilliant career with heaven knows what kind of power for good. I hold the country in the most deadly detestation. Nothing in this wide world would induce me to go back, not even if they wanted to make me an emperor. I've finished with it for ever and ever. I swear it." "You needn't look as if I were urging you to it," she laughed. "I'm sure I don't want to lose you." "All right, then," said Balthazar. "Let us talk of something else." In these early months of struggle to enter his kingdom, Balthazar came nearer to happiness than he had ever done before. A man younger or more habitually dependent on women would have counted the one thing wanting as the one prime essential, and would have regarded everything else as naught. But Balthazar, although wistfully recognizing the one missing element, was far too full of the lust of others to sit down and make moan. Marcel gave him all she could, a devoted friendship, a tender intimacy, a sympathetic understanding. He wanted infinitely more. His man's nature clamoured for the whole of her. But what she gave was of enormous comfort. It was a question of taking it or leaving it. Perhaps had his love been less, he would have left it. Love me all in all, or not at all, and be hanged to you. That might have been his attitude. Besides, he knew that by the high-handed proceeding of the primitive man, he could at any moment carry her off to the cave in Sussex Gardens. In a way, it was his own choice to live celibate. Sooner accept the graciousness she could give freely than take by force what she would yield grudgingly. Let him be happy with what he had. For he had much. Godfrey, learning to walk on his artificial foot, a miracle of running contrivance, and allowed, as it seemed, almost indefinite leave until he should reach perfection of movement, took up his quarters in his house, at first almost angrily, compelled against his will by the infernal dancing eyes and the pathetic appeal behind them, and after a short while, very contentedly, appreciating his strange father's almost womanly solicitude for his comfort, his facilities for leading his own young man's life. Far more attractive, the well-appointed house, with a snuggery of his own made over for him to have and to hold in perpetuity, with a table always spread for any friends he cared to ask to lunch or dine, with an alert intellect for companion ever ready to give of its best, with opportunities of meeting the odd, fascinating personalities whom the editor of the New Universe had gathered round him, with an atmosphere of home all the more pleasant because of its unfamiliarity than the bleak room at an overcrowded hotel, or the cramped Half-Moon Street lodgings, which in his boyish experience were the inevitable conditions of a lonely young man's existence in London. Once he said, "I know it's a delicate point, sir, but I should be awfully glad if you'd let me contribute. Pay my way, you know. It's really embarrassing for me to accept all this. I can't explain it. It's horrid. But I do wish you'd let me, sir." This was just after breakfast one morning. Balthazar paused in the act of filling his pipe. "If you like, my boy," said he, "we can discuss the matter with our housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons, and agree upon a weekly sum for your board and lodging. I know that you have independent means and can pay anything in reason. Rather than not have you here, I should agree to such an arrangement." "It would make me feel easier in my mind, sir," said Godfrey. "Shall we have her in now and get the thing over?" "Not yet," said Balthazar. "There's another side of the question. By accepting your father's house as your natural home, you are giving a very human, though faulty being, the very greatest happiness he has ever known in his life. By refusing, you would destroy something that there is no power in the wide world to replace. I don't deserve any gratitude for being your father, but after all, you're my son, and I am very proud of it. And all I have, not only in my house, but in my heart, is yours." He lit a match. "Just yours," said he, and the breath of the words blew the match out. When Godfrey next met Marcel, he told her of this. "What the devil could a fellow do," said he, "but feel a worm and grovel?" Another thing that added greatly to Balthazar's happiness was Godfrey's attitude towards Quong Ho during the vacations, when the young Chinaman was also a member of the household. "I like the beggar," said Godfrey. "He's so tactful, always on tap when one wants him, and never in the way when one doesn't. And his learning would sink a ship." Quong Ho, for his part, sat at the feet of the young English officer, and with pathetic earnestness studied him as a model of English vernacular and deportment, and at the same time sucked in from him the whole theory of the art of modern warfare. He had a genius for assimilating knowledge. With the amused aid of Lady Edna Donnithorpe and Burke, he acquired prodigious familiarity with the interrelationships of the great English families. At Balthazar's dinner table he absorbed modern political thought like a sponge. It was during the Easter vacation that he more especially determined to assume the perfect Englishman. Dr. Sheepshanks, towards the end of term, had made him an astonishing proposition. A mathematician of his calibre, said he, would be wasted in China. Why should Mr. Ho not contemplate, as fellow and professor, identification of himself with Cambridge? The war had swept away all possible contemporary rivals. It was in his power to attain in a few years not only a brilliant position in the university, but in the European world of pure science. Sheepshanks had also written in the same strain to Balthazar. And when Quong Ho modestly sought his master's advice, Balthazar vehemently supported Sheepshanks. "Of course you'll stay. Weren't those my very words at the hospital at Water End? Another time, perhaps, you'll believe me." "For many years have I been convinced of the infallibility of your judgment," said Quong Ho. "I shall also never forget," he added, "that I am merely the clay which you have moulded." "I'm beginning to think," cried Balthazar, "that I am not your friend Dr. Roosby's colossal ass after all." Balthazar was happy. He went about shouldering his way through the amazing war world, secure in his grip on all that mattered to him in life. His was a name that, once heard, stuck in men's memory. Gradually it became vaguely familiar to the general public, well known to an expanding circle. His romantic story, at first to his furious indignation, was paragraphed far and wide. The Athenaeum, under special rule, reinstated him in his membership. The intransigent policy of the new universe brought him into personal contact with the high and mighty at the heads of ministries. Invitations to speak by all manners of organizations poured in. As a speaker, his dominating personality found its supreme expression. He exulted in his newly found strength. The essential man of action had been trammelled for half a century by the robe of the scholar. The zeppelin bomb had set him naked. Said Pinnifant, meeting him in the offices of the new universe, "A year ago you didn't know there was a war on. I took you for the ruddiest freak I'd ever come across. Now you've blossomed out into a ruddy swell, bossing everything. I can't open a newspaper without seeing your name. How the hell have you managed to do it?" "Profiteering," said Balthazar. "Profiteering?" asked Pinnifant, puckering up his fat face in perplexity. "What's your line?" "Brains," said Balthazar. He turned away delighted. Well, it came to that. There was no arrogance about it. He was giving everything in his power to the country. Oppressed at one time by the sense of physical fitness, and fired by the sudden urgent demand for manpower, he had, in one of his Gordian knot-cutting moods, marched into a recruiting office and vaunted his brawn and muscle. "I'm 50, said he, "but I defy anybody to say I'm not physically equal to any boy of 25. But they had politely laughed at him and sent him away, raging furiously. It was then that he followed the despised counsel of the unimaginative Burtonshaw, K.C., and joined the Special Constabulary and the National Volunteers. "What's the next thing you're going to take on?" asked Marcel. "First, my dear," said he, "the whole running of this war. Then the administration of the kingdom of God on earth." "What a boy you are!" she laughed. "A damn fine boy," said Balthazar. One fine Sunday in May she came up to town to lunch with him alone, Godfrey being away somewhere or other for the week-end. "My dear," he cried excitedly as soon as she arrived, "I've been dying to see you. It's going to happen." "What?" She smiled into his eager face. There was nothing so extravagant that it could not happen to Balthazar. "There's talk of a new ministry, a ministry of propaganda." "Well?" "Can't you guess?" Her eyes glistened suddenly. "You? Minister?" He nodded. "It's all in the clouds at the present. At least these whifflers of Cloud Cuckoo City think it is. But I don't. They don't see the star of John Balthazar in the ascendant. I do. My dear, there's not an adverse influence in all the bag of planetary tricks." If he could have seen and appreciated what was happening some 40 miles off, he might have observed in a certain conjunction of planets, to wit Venus and Mars, something that would have modified his optimistic prognostication. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. There they were in a punt on one of the silent upper reaches of the Thames above Molesford. Venus in white serge, with a blue veil around hat and throat, reclining gracefully on the cushions, and Mars in white flannels standing, punt-pole in hand. It was one of those days when spring, in exuberant mood, throws off her shyness and masquerades in the gorgeousness of summer. The noontide vapours quivered over the sun-baked meadow beyond the towpath, and the shadows beneath the willows on the opposite bank loomed black and cool. The punt was proceeding up a patch of blazing river, and the drops from the poles sparkled like diamonds. Just ahead there was a bend lapped in the violent shade of overhanging elms. "This is the nearest thing to heaven," said Lady Edna. "Wait till we tie up under the trees, and it'll be heaven itself," said Godfrey. Even in the boating times of peace this stretch was rarely frequented, being too far both from the London crowd, whose general limit was Goring, and for the Oxford town excursionist, who seldom pushed below Wallingford. Also the cognoscenti declared it an uninteresting bit of river, dull and flat, devoid of the unspeakable charm of Cliveden and Pangbourne, and therefore unworthy of a special consideration. Still, the river is the river. Talk to an Englishman of the river, and he will not think of the Severn or the Wye, or the historic highway between London Bridge and the sea, but of those few miles of England's fairy stream, the beloved haunts of beauty and gentleness and love and laughter, where all the cares of the world are soothed into dreamful ease, and the vague passions and aspirations of youth are transformed into magical definition. To the Londoner, at any rate, it is as sacred as Westminster Abbey. So the stretches of loveliness pronounced dull by the superior were never neglected, and even this remote section, on Sundays especially, had its sparse devotees. But now, in wartime, not a blade or oar or paddle, not a glistening punt-pole disturbed the sweet stillness of the waters. Only once since they had left the boat-house had a barge passed them, a barge gay as to its poop with yellow and red, a thin spiral of smoke from its cabin funnel proclaiming the cooking of the Sunday dinner, while the barge folk lounged on deck, their eyes and attitudes suggestive of those who were already overfed on lotus, and one small freckled sun-wraith of a child flitted along the towpath beside the mild old horse. But half an hour had passed since then. The very meadows no longer showed the once familiar pairs of Sunday lovers. Were it not for the pleasant cows, it would have been a scene of lovely desolation. "There," said Godfrey, shipping the pole and guiding the punt by the aid of the branches to a mooring. "Allow me to introduce you to heaven." She kissed her hand to the greenery and the dark water, and laughed lightly. "How do you do, heaven?" Godfrey turned from the rope in which he had made fast, and stumbled to the floor of the punt. She started up in alarm. "Your foot, dear." He laughed. "It's all right this time. Sometimes I forget it's a fake." He sat beside her on the cushions and pointed to a basket in front of them. "Shall we start on the nectar and ambrosia, or is it too early?" "Let us wait a bit and take in heaven first." "What on earth are you doing?" she asked a moment afterwards, as he established himself, elbows on knees and chin in hands, and stared close into her blue eyes. "I'm taking in all the heaven that matters to me," said Godfrey. "Do I matter so much?" "You do." "Light me a cigarette," said Lady Edna. He obeyed, handed her one alight, and she put it between her lips. "I love doing that," said he. "I've never done it for any other woman in my life." She arched her eyebrows. "Does his sultanship think he's conferring an unprecedented honour on a poor woman?" "Oh, Edna," his boyish face flushed suddenly. "You know what I mean. I never dreamed that a wonderful woman would even dream of taking anything from my lips to hers. Look." He lit another cigarette and held it out to her. "Let me have yours." "Baby," she said, making the exchange. All of which imbecility was very bad and sad and mad, but to the united youth in the punt it was peculiarly agreeable. "What a difference from last weekend," she said contentedly after a while. "What happened then?" "I had all the stuff boxes in London down, Edgar included." "And my venerable sire, I remember. I was at the War Office all Sunday, and it poured with rain. What did you do with them?" "I stroked them and fed them and put them through their little tricks," she laughed. Then she added more seriously, "It happened to be a very important day for your father. The government has gone crazy on finding out new forceful men and clearing out the incompetent political hacks. Edgar's just hanging on by the skin of his teeth, you know. Well, they've discovered your remarkable father, and last weekend they practically fixed it up with him. A new Ministry of Propaganda." "Oh," she laughed again, "I didn't have such a bad time after all. But," she sighed, "this is better. Don't let us think of wars or politics or Edgars and such horrible things." She threw her cigarette into the water and bent down to the basket. "Let us lunch." It had been indeed an important day for Balthazar. The house near Molesford, Lady Edna's personal possession, a vast, square, red-brick, late Georgian building, standing in grounds that reached down to the river, had been filled with anxiously chosen high and mightinesses, among whom her husband, minister though he was, shone like an inferior satellite. It was the last move in the game on behalf of John Balthazar, which he had played for many weeks. "What are you asking that damned fellow for?" Edgar Duninthorpe had asked, looking at the list of guests. "Because he amuses me." "He doesn't amuse me," snapped her husband. He was a little thin man, with thin grey hair and a thin moustache and a thin voice. Up to a few months ago she had treated him with contemptuous tolerance. Now she had begun to dislike him exceedingly. "If you don't want to meet Mr. Balthazar," she replied, "you can stay in London." They sparred in the unedifying manner of ill-assorted husband and wife. "I'm sick of seeing this overbearing adventurer in my house," he said. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. I'm not going to let you make a fool of yourself." "My dear man," she replied cuttingly, "if I were looking out for a lover, this time I should take a young one." She laughed scornfully and swept away. Long smouldering resentment had been suddenly fanned into the flame of open hostility. She raged in her heart against him. Never before had he dared to insinuate such a taint in her political interest in any man. She, Lady Edna Donnithorpe, to carry on an intrigue with John Balthazar? The insult of it! The next day brought a short but fierce encounter. "You pretend to be jealous. You're not. You're envious. You're envious of a bigger man than yourself. You're afraid of him. You little minnows hate Tritons. I quite understand." In the wrath of a weak and foolish man, he sputtered unforgettable words which no woman ever forgives. She faced him with lips as thin as his own, and her languorous eyes hardened into little dots of jade. "You had better see to it that I don't break you," she said. "Break me? How? Politically?" He laughed a thin laugh of derision. "In the first place you couldn't. In the second you wouldn't. What would become of your position if I were out of the government?" "I can very well look after myself," she replied. On Saturday morning he made some apology for loss of temper, which she coldly accepted on condition of his courteous treatment of John Balthazar. And so it fell that, when the subject of all this to-do arrived at Molesford, he found himself almost effusively welcomed by the negative Edgar, and thrust into the inner circle of the higher mightnesses assembled. As the latter took Balthazar very seriously as a coming power in the country, and as Lady Edna's attitude towards him was marked by no especial characteristic, Edgar Dunningthorpe came to the unhappy conclusion that he had made a fool of himself, and during the informal discussion on the creation of the new ministry, for which purpose the weekend party had gathered together, he had dared do little more than just hint a fault and hesitate to dislike when Balthazar's name was mentioned, which pusillanimity, coming to his wife's ears, deepened her resentment against him, and only Balthazar's triumphal exit on the Monday morning restrained her from giving it practical expression. Sufficient for the day was the success thereof. In the lazy punt that gracious spring morning, she strove to drive the last weekend from her thoughts. She revelled in the unusual and the audacious. Edgar had gone to Paris on an international conference. Only an ancient and faded aunt, Lady Letitia Varden, a sort of permanent aristocratic caretaker, was in the house. Godfrey, the sole guest. And Aunt Letitia had caught a God-sent cold and was staying in bed. They two had the whole bright day before them, and the scented evening, with never a soul to obtrude on their idyllic communion. She had always snapped her fingers at convention, but Lady Edna Donnithorpe, chartered libertine, had always observed the terms of her charter, her heart never having tempted her to break them. This delicious breach was a different matter altogether. She had even dared to put off 2 or 3 previously invited friends. She told him this while he helped her to chicken and ham. He proclaimed her the most wonderful thing in the world. "Don't you think I deserve one little day's holiday in the year? Just a holiday from the talk, the smiling, the wheedling, the scheming, with my brain ever on alert and seeming to grow bigger and bigger as the night goes on, till it almost bursts my head when I lie down to sleep." "Why do you do it?" he asked. She shrugged her graceful shoulders. "I don't know. I used to love it. Now I'm beginning to hate it. I was at a wedding a day or 2 ago. Charlie Horton and Minnie Lavering. You know whom I mean, don't you? They haven't a sixpence between them. And they look so happy. Oh, so damned happy." Her voice broke adorably. "But I nearly wept." He neglected his own plateful of chicken and ham and bent forward over the basket between them. "I'd do anything in the wide world to make you happy, Edna." "I know you would," she smiled. "You're doing your best now. It's an excellent best. But it might be better if you fished out the salt." While she helped herself daintily from the paper packet which he held out, he laughed, adoring her ever-ready trick of switching off the sentimental current. "Now you're really just a little bit happy, aren't you?" She nodded intimately, which emboldened him to say, "For the life of me, I can't see what induced you to take up with a rotten sort of cripple like me." "Neither can I," she replied composedly, "except perhaps that the rotten cripple is a very brave and distinguished soldier." "Rubbish," said Godfrey. "There are hundreds of thousands like me all over the place, as indistinguishable from one another as peas in a peck." "Won't you allow a poor woman just a nice sense of discrimination?" "I'll allow the one woman in the universe," said Godfrey, "to have everything she pleases." "Then that's that," said Lady Edna. They finished their meal happily, drank hot coffee from a thermos flask, and smoked and talked. As on the first day he had sat beside her, so now, under the spell of her keen sympathy, he told her of all his doings. For the past 2 or 3 months they had been of absorbing interest. He had besieged the War Office, as he had gloriously threatened, until one day he received an appointment on the staff of the Director General of Military Operations. That it was due to any other influence than his own furious and persistent attacks, he had not the remotest suspicion. He had dashed away from the amazing interview in a taxi to Lady Edna, whom by good chance he found at home, and vaunted his generalship. His father's blood sang in his veins. The lady to whom, in close conspiracy with Lady Northby, he owed the billet, coveted by thousands of men, wounded and whole, welcomed his news with the smiling surprise of a mother who listens to her offspring's tale of the wondrous gifts of Santa Claus. It was one of the characteristics of Lady Edna Donnithorpe to love the secret meed of secret services, a far more subtle joy than the facile gratitude poured on a Lady Bountiful. Besides, such a reputation would in itself destroy her power. Many women of her acquaintance who had enjoyed it for a brief season during the war had seen the sacred shoulders of authority turned frozenly upon them. She was not one of those women acting from thoughtless impulse or vanity. The game of intrigue fascinated her. She knew her winnings and hoarded them, but they were the concern of no one in the wide world. Perhaps the time might come when she could say to Godfrey, "All that you are, you owe to me. I have made you, and I have made your father. I can show you proofs. What are you going to do?" Blackmail of a kind, certainly. A woman driven up against a wall is justified in using any weapons of defence. But all this lay hidden in the self-protective instinct. No thought of it marred her triumph. She listened to his fairy tales of the Allies' war organisation with a twofold pride. First, in this vicarious entrance into the jealously guarded ark of the government, whereby she gained exact knowledge of mighty happenings to come, denied even to the self-important Edgar. Secondly, in her unerring judgment of men. For Balthazar had told her a week before of his meeting with one of Godfrey's chiefs, who had given the boy unreserved praise. Whereupon she had herself made it her week's business to track the social doings of the great man until she ran him down a day or two ago at a friend's house, and in reply to her tactful questionings he had replied, "Baltazar, lots of brains, brilliant fellow with wonderful power of detail. Son of that astonishing chap John Baltazar, just come to life again, everybody's talking about. You needn't be afraid, we've spotted him right enough." She was sufficiently versed in affairs to know that a Major General does not speak of a third-grade staff officer, and at the very tail of the grade at that, in eulogistic terms, even to Lady Edna Doningthorpe, without good reason. She hugged the word brilliant to her heart. And while Godfrey talked that May afternoon, she felt that she was justified in all that she had done, was doing, and was going to do. Yet though what she had done gave her perfect satisfaction, and what she was doing was blatantly obvious, what she was going to do lay dimly hidden behind a rosy veil. For the moment this handsome, clean-run boy to whom she had given her heart, much to her own amazement, was contented with platonic adoration in a punt. How long, she wondered, would his contentment last? How long indeed would her own? Well, vogue la galère, pole the spring-tide punt, let her drain to its full the unprecedented glory of the day. The cares of her crowded, youth-consuming life fell from her, and she became young again, younger than she had been before her loveless marriage. As she responded, laughing, to his eager, boyish foolishness, she felt that she had never known till then what it was to be young. She felt an infinite craving for all that she had missed. And Godfrey, standing there in careless grace, punt-pole in hand, alert, confident, radiant in promise, was the incarnation of it all, of all the youth and laughter and love that she had passed by, scornfully unheeding. She feasted her hungry eyes on him. Not only was he good to look at in his physical perfection, he was good to think upon. He had faced death 1,000 times, no doubt as debonairly as he faced the current of the mild river. He, that boy whom a whisper could compel to her bidding, had led men through mazes of unimagined blood and slaughter. If he had one worm gnawing at his heart, it was the desire to get back again to this defiant comradeship with death. She looked up the record of the achievement that had won for him the military cross. What a man he was! And as she watched him, there floated across her vision the figure of a thin, dry, self-seeking politician, and she shivered in the sunshine. And as there chanced to be a pause in the boyish talk, she let her thoughts wander on. No one had ever called her thin, dry husband a brilliant man, not even the most sycophantic place-hunter who had intrigued for her seat at her table. But in such terms had the first authority to whom she had spoken characterized Godfrey. Not only was he the ordinary heroic young officer, he was a brilliant man, who would make his mark as part of the brain that controlled the destinies of the British Army. And all the sex in her humbled itself deliciously in the knowledge that this paragon of all Bayards, of this Bayard of all paragons, loved her with all his youth and manhood. Presently she noticed a change in his happy face. A spasm of pain seemed to pass across it. He drew out the pole, stood with it poised. He drove it in again, his jaws set in an ugly way. She waited till the end of the stroke. Then she rose to her feet. "Stop, dear, stop. You're overdoing it." "Overdoing what?" "Your foot." "Nonsense. Do sit down." He gathered up the dripping pole preparatory for the thrust, but she caught his arm. "I'm sure your foot's hurting you." "It isn't," he declared, bending his weight on it. "Not a little bit." But even as he spoke he made an unconscious grimace. "Do you love me?" He drew a sharp breath at the categorical question. In 1,000 indirect ways he had told her of his devotion, but he had never spoken the explicit words. He said quietly and half-wonderingly, "You know I love you." "Then don't hurt me by hurting yourself." "Do you really care what happens to me?" he asked. "I love you better than anything in the world," she said. They paddled home, somewhat sobered by the mutual declaration, about which they said nothing more. He admitted overstrain of the still sensitive tissues of the base of the stump, and railed at his misfortune. It was so humiliating to confess defeat. She smiled. There might, she said, be compensation. When they landed, she insisted on his leaning on her for support during the walk up to the house, and although he suffered damnable torture whenever he set the artificial foot on the ground, for his pressure on her adorable shoulder was of the slightest, his progress was one of deliciously compensating joy. They dined decorously under the inscrutable eyes of butler and parlour-maid, and after dinner they called for coat and wrap and went out to sit on the moonlit terrace. As he put the fur-lined cloak round her, his hand touched her cheek. She put up her hand caressingly and held his there while she looked up at him in the dimness. He bent down, greatly daring, and touched her lips. Then suddenly she clasped his head and held his kiss, long and passionately. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. They arranged it all between them in the comfortingly short-sighted way of thousands of reprehensible couples before them. They spoke vaguely of a divorce, as though the wretched Edgar were the conjugal offender, and pictured a time in the future, after the war, when they should marry and live the bright and perfect life. In the meanwhile they proposed to find much happiness and consolation together. He gave her, she declared, what she had vainly been hungering for since early childhood, love and sympathy and understanding. Into his sensitive ears she poured the story of her disastrous marriage, of the far-separated lives of her husband and herself, of his envies and trivial basenesses. Godfrey had thought her courted and flattered, a woman passing rich in love and friendship. Really, she had moved the loneliest thing on earth. Didn't he see now what he meant to her? She had been starving, and he gave her food. If he withdrew it now, she would die. This self-abasement from high estate established her martyrdom in the eyes of the chivalrous youth. He swore eternal devotion, his soul registering the vow. They wrote frequently to each other, and met as often as they could. 3 mornings a week, at an astonishingly early hour, she left her house soberly clad for the purpose of working at a mythical canteen. On these mornings Godfrey waited for her at a discreet distance round the corner of the square, in a 2-seater car, for which, as a crippled staff officer, he had contrived to obtain a petrol permit. An hour's run, Richmond Park, Barnes Common, it mattered little where, and Lady Edna went demurely home to breakfast, and Godfrey to his day's work at the War Office. Of the canteen Edgar Donnithorpe knew nothing, for she had merely tossed the invention to her maid, until one morning, coming down earlier than usual, he met her ascending the stairs. "Good Lord," said he, "what have you been doing at this unearthly hour?" Irritated, having to lie to him, she replied, "I've been doing an hour's shift at a canteen. Have you any objection?" He shrugged his shoulders. "Why should I? If it pleases you and doesn't hurt the Tommies, poor devils." His sneer jarred on her guilty sensitiveness. Her eyes hardened. "Why poor devils?" "Like the rest of the country," he replied, "at the mercy of the amateur." He turned with his thin laugh and left her speechless with futile anger. She wondered how she had ever regarded him otherwise than with unmitigated hatred. She told the incident to Godfrey, having reached the point of confiding to him such domestic bickerings. He set his teeth and damned the fellow. How could this incomparable angel dwell in the same house with him? She sighed. If it were not for the war. But during the war the house was the centre of her manifold activities on behalf of the country. As for the social side of it, she would throw that up tomorrow only too gladly. Heavens, how weary she was of it all. "I wish to God I could take you away with me," said the young man fiercely. "I wish you could, dear," she said in her caressing tone. "But in the meantime we have these happy little hours. We mustn't ask too much of fate." "I only ask what fate gives to any man, that bus driver and that policeman, the woman he loves." "I'm afraid," she laughed, "if you heard the history of their vie amoureuse, you would be dreadfully disillusioned. It seems to me that everybody marries the wrong person in this muddled pairing world. We must make the best of it." At this period, infatuated though she was, she had no idea of breaking away from convention, even to the extent of setting up a household separate from her husband's. Social life was dear to her, for all her asseverations to the contrary, and dearer still the influence that she could command. Yet, as the days went on, she noticed signs of restiveness in Godfrey. An hour thrice a week in an open car, when half his attention had to be devoted to the preservation of their own and other people's lives, scarcely satisfied his young ardour. The times when he could lounge free in her boudoir from 4 to 6 were over. As an officer on the staff of the Director-General of Operations, he knew no hours. The intricate arrangements for the mobility of the British Army did not depend on the convenience of young gentlemen at the War Office. Such had to scorn delight and lived laborious days, which on the occasions of the special military activity were apt to run into the nights. Now and then, of course, Godfrey could assure himself an hour or so for lunch, but never could he foretell it on the day before. Only once, by hasty telephoning, did they manage to meet for lunch at the Carlton. In the evenings they were a little more successful, now and again a theatre together. But Godfrey, suddenly becoming sensitive on the point of honour, refused opportunities of dining at Belgrave Square. "If I love a man's wife, I can't sit at his table and drink his wine and smile at him," he proclaimed bluntly. "It seems," she said at last, "there's nothing left but for me to run away with you." "Why not?" he asked, laughing, for her tone was light. "What about the British Army?" He reflected. If she had said what about morality, or Christianity, or his immortal soul, he would have damned any item of them offhand. But he couldn't damn the British Army. He temporized. "I don't quite see." "If you ran away with me, you'd have to run an awful long way, and leave the army in the lurch." "That would never do," said Godfrey. "So we'll have to sacrifice ourselves for our country till the war's over," said Lady Edna. Then, in spite of philosophic and patriotic resolve, the relations between them grew to be uncertain and dangerous. Aware of this, she sought to play rather the part of Egeria than that of the unhappy wife claiming consolation from her lover. Now about this time arose rumours of political dissatisfaction in certain quarters, of differences of opinion between the civil and the military high authorities. Wild gossip animated political circles, and the wilder it became, the more it was fostered, here malignantly, then honestly, by political factions opposed to the government or to the conjectured strategical conduct of the war. Lady Edna Donnithorpe, in the thick of everything that darkened counsel, found the situation obscure. What were the real facts from the military point of view? She discussed matters with Godfrey, who, regarding her as his second self, the purest well of discretion, told her artlessly what he knew. As a matter of fact, she loyally kept her inner information to herself, but her eyes were opened to vast schemes of which the little political folk about her were ignorant. And one of the most ignorant and most blatantly cocksure about everything was Edgar Donnithorpe, her husband, whose attitude in view of her knowledge began to fill her with vague disquietude. To all this political unrest, Balthazar was loftily indifferent. "The scum of the world's hell broth," said he. "Skim it off and chuck it away. Let us get on with the cooking." He was cooking with all his might, preparing the ingredients of the contemplated new ministry. Everything must be organized before the final step was taken. No fiasco like the jerry-built Ministry of National Service should be possible. Brains, policy, a far-spread scheme complete in detail first, then the building and the simple machinery of clerks and typists. He worked from morning to night, as indeed he had done all his life long. The Universal Review sped full sail on a course of fantastic prosperity. The man had the touch of genius that makes success. He spared himself neither mentally nor physically. He found time for enthusiastic work with the National Volunteers and the Special Constabulary, which formerly he had scorned. As a special constable he quickly gained promotion, of which he was inordinately proud. Said Marcel, "I believe that running about in an air raid is the greatest joy of your life." To which, in his honest, egotistical way, he replied, "I'm not quite so sure that it isn't." And Godfrey, to Marcel, discussing him, "The dear old dynamo has hitched himself onto the war with a vengeance." He had. It absorbed him from the moment of waking to the moment of falling asleep. Since Godfrey's appointment at the War Office, father and son, living in the same house, met so seldom that they grew each to set an exaggerated value on the other. The boy, conscious not only himself of the force of the man, but of the tribute paid to it by the gods and demigods of the land, withdrew his original suspicious antagonism, and surrendered loyally. "I'm proud of him. My God, I am," he said to Marcel. "My childish faith is justified. I take back all I've said this last year. He's a marvel, and I'm glad I'm his son." He saw, perhaps, at this stage, more of Marcel than of Edna. For Marcel, shortly after her lunch with Balthazar on the day of Godfrey's river idyll, had broken down in health and left Churton Towers. The strain of 3 years' incessant work had ended in collapse. She was ordered 3 months' rest. After a weary fortnight alone in the Cornish country, she had come to London, in spite of medical advice, and shared the Bayswater flat of a friend, a working woman engaged at the Admiralty. Chance, perhaps a little bit of design, for the motives that determine a woman's decision are often sadly confused, had thus brought her within easy walking distance of Sussex Gardens, and of what the strange man to whose fortunes destiny seemed to link her, and whom uncontrollable fears and forces restrained her from marrying, loved to call the house of Baltazar. Of course, in his headstrong way, he vehemently put the house at her disposal. He would fix up a suite of apartments for her, where she could live, her own mistress, just as she chose. Godfrey, Quong Ho, and servants could go to the devil. They could pick it anywhere about the house they liked. They would all agree on the paramount question of her comfort and happiness. "In God's name, why not?" he cried with a large gesture. "What are you afraid of? Me? Mrs. Grundy? What?" But Marcel shook her head, smiling and stubborn, and would have none of it. As a concession, she agreed to run round whenever she heard through the telephone that she was wanted. Balthazar grinned and foretold a life of peripatetic discomfort. "I'll risk that," she said. Thus it happened that Marcel was in and out of the house at all seasons, Godfrey clamouring for her as much as his father. Under vow of secrecy, he confided to her his love affair. At first she professed deep disapprobation. He should remember her first suspicions and grave warnings. A married woman? No good could come of such an entanglement, no matter how guiltless and romantic. As delicately as he could, he reminded her that she herself had cherished a romantic attachment to a married man. She had, further, avowed her readiness to run off with him. Edna and he were no whit worse than the impeccable Marcel and his revered father. Whereupon, doting rather foolishly on the young man, she yielded, listened to the varied developments of his adventure, and gave sympathy or moral advice, according to the exigencies of the occasion. Her position of confidante, however, caused her many qualms of conscience. Her common sense told her that he was treading the path to an all-too commonplace bonfire. The woman was some years older than he. Marcel admitted her beauty and superficial charm, but her feminine instinct pounced on insincerities, affectations, and hardnesses undreamed of by the guileless worshipper. She divined, to her great dismay, a sudden sex upheaval in this young and self-thwarted woman, rather than a pure passion of love. What ought she to do? The question kept her awake of nights. She could not, without breaking the most solemn specific promise, ask counsel of Baltazar. Nor could she refuse to listen further to the boy. He would go his own way and leave her in the misery of incertitude. To go pleading to Lady Edna, like the heavy mother in a French play, was unimaginable. What then remained for her but to continue to receive his confidences? And even then, if she met them with copybook maxims, he would turn on her with his original tu quoque, and if she persisted, it would be equivalent to the withdrawal of her sympathetic attention. The only course, therefore, that remained open was to let things go on as they were, and as far as it lay in her power, to keep his feet from pitfalls. His strange mixture, precipitated by the war, of child and man, appealed to all the woman within her. In his dealings with men, she saw him with pride at his father's table, he had the air and the experience of 35. In dealing with women, even with her own motherly self, he was the romantic, unsophisticated boy of 18. His real age now was 21, and at the back of her clean mind lay the conviction that Lady Edna, however indiscreet she might be, could not make the complete and criminal fool of herself. This conviction deepened when she had an opportunity of seeing them again together at a little dinner party of 6 to which Balthazar had invited Lady Edna and the Jackmans. Between them it was Godfrey and Edna, frank and undisguised. Their friendship was obvious too her charming assumption of proprietorship. But she carried it off with the air of a beautiful woman accustomed to such domination over the men she admitted to her intimacy. Beyond this, Marcel could espy nothing, not a soft word, not a covert glance that betrayed a deeper sentiment. It is all play to her, she concluded, and grew happier in her mind. Toward the end of the evening, after the Jackmans had gone, Lady Edna said lightly to Balthazar, "This boy has told me all sorts of wonderful things about his den here, and I've never seen it." Balthazar waved one hand and put the other on Godfrey's shoulder. "Me shall do the honours." "Would you really like to see it?" Godfrey asked innocently. "Of course I should. Your souvenirs." Balthazar beamed at them till they left the drawing-room. "It's the best day's work I ever did for Godfrey," said he. "What?" "Getting him in with Lady Edna. A young fellow wants a clever woman to shepherd him. Does him no end of good. Broadens his mind." "Mayn't it be a bit dangerous?" Marcel hazarded. "Dangerous? Suppose he does think himself in love with her. All the better. Keeps him out of mischief." "But she might possibly fall in love with him too." Wise in the hermit's theoretic wisdom, he dismissed such an absurdity with a scornful laugh. "Ha! That type of woman can't fall in love. She's of the earth earthly, of the world worldly. Otherwise she couldn't have married that rat of a Donnithorpe." "I suppose it's all right," said Marcel. "You belovedest mid-Victorian survival?" He laughed. "I do believe the young woman's proposal shocked you." They both would have been, if not shocked, at least brought to a sense of actual things, had they seen the transports to which the lovers surrendered themselves as soon as the door of the den closed behind them. Many hundreds of millions of youthful pairs have done exactly the same after long separation. She threw herself into his arms, in which he enfolded her. They kissed and sighed. They thought they would never be alone again. He'd been thirsting for her lips all the tantalizing evening. That wonderful brain of hers to suggest this visit to his room. Even if the idea had occurred to his dull, masculine mind, he wouldn't have had the daring to tender the invitation. Her ever-new adorableness, and more kisses and raptures, until, side by side in the corner of the couch, they began to talk of rational matters. "There are great things brewing," she said after a while. "Just a whisper has reached me, enough to make it dangerous." "What things do you refer to?" he asked, with a quick knitting of the brow. She had told him of a wild distortion of the plans of the High Command current in political dining-rooms. "It's damnable!" he cried angrily. "One tiny grain of fact to a mountain of imagination. For God's sake, make it your business to go about crabbing the lie for all you're worth." "I will. When you really know, you can speak with such moral authority that you're believed, or they don't give away a bit of your knowledge. At least, anyone with a little experience can do it." "And you're an adept," he said admiringly. She drew him nearer, for he had started away on his proclamation of the damnability of rumours. "What is the grain of fact?" "Why, the great-scale offensive." "And where's the rest of the rumour incorrect?" "I don't think I ought to tell you." "But don't you see how important it is that a woman in my position, and a woman of my character, should know exactly? Half the calamities of the war are due to women giving away half-secrets of which they're not allowed to realize the consequences. Give a woman full confidence, and she'll be on the side of the angels." He kissed her and laughed. Was she not one of the angelic band herself? She pleaded subtly, her head on his shoulder, her deep blue eyes looking up into his, her breath on his cheek. Surely he and she were one heart, one mind, one soul. Individually, each was the other's complement. He could work out vast schemes. The most junior of third-grade staff officers glowed at the flattery, and she could see, not that they were put into execution, but that wicked and irresponsible gossip should not bring them to naught. In her woman's wheedling she had no ulterior purpose in view. She was not the political adventuress unscrupulously seducing enamoured youth to the betrayal of his country. It was all insatiable curiosity and lust for secret power. And as far as lay in her nature, she loved the boy. She loved him with a sense of possession. She craved him wholly, his devotion, his mind, his knowledge. His physical self was hers at a moment's call. She played with that certainty in delicious trepidation. It invested their relationship in a glamour unknown, mysterious, in spite of her married estate. But the long atrophied romantic in her sprang to sudden life and prevailed. So subtly did she plead that he was unaware of her overmastering desire. Secure in her love and her loyalty, and confident in the twin hearts and souls, he told her what he knew. But the numerical and topographical details proving too confusing for her, he laughed and went over to his desk, and with her sitting over him on the arm of his writing-chair, sketched a map, annotated with facts and figures on a sheet of notepaper. When he had done, she returned to the sofa and read the notes. "Now I understand everything. It's tremendously exciting, isn't it?" "If it comes off." She folded up the paper and put it in her bosom. "Of course it'll come off." "I say, sweetheart," he cried, watching the disappearing paper, "for heaven's sake don't go leaving that about. Better stick it in the fire." "I'll do it as soon as I get home." She took his hand in delightful intimacy and glanced at his wristwatch. Then she started up. They must get back at once, lest the others should subject their absence to undesirable conjecture. "Oh, the elderly birds!" he laughed gracelessly. "They love to have a little billing and cooing now and then. They'll be grateful to us." But she would not be detained. They went up to the drawing-room. "He's got a perfect Hun museum downstairs," she said, "each piece with a breathless history." "What interested you most?" asked Marcel. "Me in a gas mask," said Godfrey, lying readily, for never a glance had Lady Edna given to the trophies and spoils which she had set forth to see. Later, after putting her into her taxi, he said through the window, "You'll destroy that scrap of paper, won't you?" "If you doubt me, I'll give it back to you now," she replied rather sharply, thrusting her hand beneath her cloak. What could ardent lover do but repudiate the charge of want of faith? She laughed, and answered in her most caressing tones, "I'm glad, for where it is now it would be awfully awkward to get at." The taxi drove off. Godfrey re-entered the house, his young head full of the thought of the paper on which he had written, lying warm deep down in the bare and sacred bosom. Lady Edna drove home to her solitary house, and without asking whether her husband was in or out, went straight to her bedroom. As soon as she could, she dismissed her maid and sat in her dressing gown for a long, long time, thinking, as a woman thinks, when for the first time in her life she is not sure of herself, when she is all but at the parting of the ways, and when each way seems to lead to catastrophe. As a cold, ambitious girl, she had sent the natural packing. Now it had come galloping back. At last she rose and went to her dressing-table. On it lay the crumpled scrap of paper. She glanced at it. The figures and lines conveyed no meaning to her tired brain. What was the warfare in the world to the warfare in her soul? She couldn't concern herself with the higher strategy tonight. Tomorrow, when she was fresh, she would tackle the intricate scheme. She put the paper into a little secret drawer of her writing-table, of which even her maid did not know the spring. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. She would read the paper tomorrow, she had said. But on the morrow she woke with a violent headache and stayed abed, and had only time to scramble into her clothes and attend a 12 o'clock committee meeting in Westminster. And for the remainder of the day, until she went to bed exhausted at midnight, she had not a minute to spare. The next morning she had her early appointment with Godfrey. She went forth into a raw air with a threat of autumn in it, and a slight drizzle from an overcast sky. The two-seater, with damp hood up, was waiting round the corner of the square. She opened the door and jumped in, almost before he was aware of her approach, and rather hysterically flung her arms about him. "Oh, darling, be good to me. I'm feeling so tired and miserable." He proclaimed himself a brute for dragging her out on such a filthy morning. It was super-angelic of her to come, but he had scarcely expected her. Wouldn't it be better to go back home and rest? "No, no, dear," she murmured. "This is my rest. Beside you. Storm or sunshine, what does it matter, so long as we're together?" "Doesn't matter to me," said he, driving off. "Hell and damnation would be paradise if I always had you with me." And in the same emotional key they talked all the time during their drive through a dank and dismal world. They felt like Paolo and Francesca in Wart's picture, clinging together alone in comfortless space, remote from War Office and wars and other affairs of men. She wailed, "Oh, darling, if only I had met you before I made my wretched marriage." "Yes, by God," said Godfrey, setting his teeth and feeling very fierce. It did not occur to either of them, in their unhumorous mood, that when she married he was a gawky boy of 16. Gradually they came to vital things. "If I were little Mrs. Tomkins, whom nobody knows, we could get a hidden nest somewhere, you and I. It would be happiness, and it would be hurting or betraying nobody. But I'm Lady Edna Donnithorpe, related to half the peerage, and known by sight to everybody who looks at an illustrated paper." "Why not cut everything and make a bolt of it?" asked Godfrey, glaring straight in front of him at the cheerless, almost empty road, his young face set very stern. "Your career." He cursed his career. "Your soldier's post. How can you leave it? You're doing a man's work for your country." "Hell take it," said he. "Take what?" "The whole infernal universe," he growled, and swerved viciously so as to avoid imminent collision with an indignant motor bus. Again they came to the bedrock fact of his soldier's duty. On their return journey it rained in torrents. "You'll get wet through if you walk," said he, when they arrived at their trysting spot. "I'll drive you up to the house and chance it." He chanced it, helped her out of the car, and stood on the pavement, watching her until she had let herself in with her latchkey. She ran upstairs, to be confronted with her husband at the door of his room, which was on the same landing. He was in his dressing gown, and one side of his face was shaven, the other lathered. "I thought you went to a canteen in the mornings." "So I do," she replied calmly. "Does young Baltazar work there too?" "Young Baltazar very often calls for me, when it rains, on his way to the War Office, and gives me a lift home." "You're seeing far too much of that young man." "The last time we discussed the Baltazar family," she said, with a scornful laugh, "you accused me of an intrigue with his father. My dear Edgar, go on with your shaving, and don't be idiotic." She flung into her room, angry and humiliated. After all, Edgar had the right to consider his good name, even though his jealousy could not proceed from betrayed affection. This was the first time he had referred to Godfrey in any way. Uneasiness beset her. So did the eternal question of the deceitful wife. How much did he know? They did not meet that day till dinner-time. It was one of the rare occasions on which they dined alone together, when he seemed to be making amends for the morning's attack by more than usual courteous conversation on current events. They parted amicably. The next afternoon, arriving home very late, she was surprised at seeing him coming, half-dressed for dinner, from her room. He smiled in a friendly way and held up a button-hook. "Mine's nowhere to be seen, that's confounded new parlour-maid. Hope you don't mind." "We're getting quite domestic," she said ironically. "It's pleasanter," said he. She wondered much at his graciousness for the next few days. He became attentive, manifested dry solicitude as to her health and her social and political interests. She dreaded a recrudescence of the thin sentiment that, on his part, had sanctioned their marriage. The fear tainted the joy of her visits to the mythical canteen. Sooner open hostility than this semblance of conjugal affection. "I'm sorry, darling, to have been so mouldy," she said, taking leave of Godfrey one morning, "but the situation is getting on my nerves. I'm fed up." A day or two later, Edgar Donnythorpe entered her sitting-room, where she was writing letters. "Sorry to interrupt you, Edna," said he, "but have you definitely decided to go to Molesford this next week-end?" "Certainly. I told you. The Barringtons and Susie Delamere and one or two others are coming." "Do you mind if I don't turn up till Sunday?" "Of course not," she replied. He was exceedingly polite. "Thanks," said he. "The fact is, I want to ask a dozen men or so to dinner here. Only men, you know." She glanced at him, rather puzzled, for his proposal was an unprecedented departure from the custom of the house. Hitherto he had given his men's political dinner parties at his club. There had been no arrangement or understanding between them as to this mode of entertainment, but so had it chanced to be, and he was a creature of routine. "Of course, just as you like. But what's wrong with the only place fit to dine at in London?" "It's wartime, my dear," said he, eyeing her shiftively. "Wartime. All the clubs have gone to the devil." "All right. If you tell me how many are coming, I'll see to it." No, please don't. Please don't worry your head about it." He made a step forward and held up his thin hand in a deprecatory sort of way. "I'll fix it up. I don't want it to be the slightest bit of concern to you. Thanks so much." He hurried out. Lady Edna frowned at her half-written letter. A devious man, Edgar. What was in the wind? The cook, the next day, however, submitted to her a menu which, with a housewifely modification or so, she passed, and thought no more of the material banquet. During the week the hint of a rumour reached her, when, at a public meeting, she ran up against the Right Honourable Sir Berkeley Prynne, a member of the government who had been hostile to her husband for many years, and had only given the hatchet superficial burial during the party truce. "I suppose you know a lot of us are quaking in our shoes," he said, half banteringly. "I don't," she said, "but I've no doubt it's good for you. What's the matter?" "Signs of underground rumblings. Your quick ears have detected nothing?" "No, really, honour bright. Do tell me." He shook his head and laughed. "It'll be a washout," said he, moving away. Jibe or warning, Sir Berkeley's words were not devoid of significance. They were aimed at her husband. Underground rumblings meant intrigue. She had long suspected Edgar of half-hearted support for the government, but passionate devotion to anything was so foreign to his crafty, opportunist nature that she had not greatly troubled her mind about his loyalty. Here, however, was cause for deeper consideration. The old hacks, as she had said to Godfrey, were being squeezed out as decently as might be, so as to give place to fresher and honester men, and Edgar's position was daily growing more insecure. But she thought he was sticking to it desperately. Was the worm about to turn, and had the projected dinner party anything to do with the turning? She asked him, casually, who were coming. "Men connected with the business of the ministry," he replied. "People I must be civil to, and who don't expect us to worry about their women-folk." And she had to be contented with the answer. On the Saturday afternoon at Molesford she was surprised to see Rolliter, the old butler, who she thought was staying the night at Belgrave Square to superintend the dinner party. Why was he here? "Mr. Donnythorpe's orders, my lady. He said he could get on quite well without me this evening. I couldn't insist, my lady, but I didn't like leaving it at all, especially as Lord Trevanion was coming." "Lord who?" she cried, for he had mentioned a name that was anathema maranatha in government circles. "I think it's Trevanion, my lady," said the butler, rather taken aback by her expression of incredulity. He fished a paper from his pocket and consulted it. "Yes, my lady, I saw the list on Mr. Donnythorpe's table, so I copied it out so as to write the name cards before I left." An idea struck her. "You did this without Mr. Donnythorpe's orders?" Yes, my lady. Mr. Donnythorpe being so busy, I thought it might slip his memory." "Did you write the cards?" "No, my lady. When Mr. Donnythorpe told me to come down here, I asked him about the name cards, and he said he didn't want them." "Let me see the list," she said, recovering her languid manner. "Certainly, my lady." He handed her the paper. "The only reason I mentioned Lord Trevanion," he continued, "was because I happen to know his lordship is one of the most particular men in England, and I couldn't bear to have things done anyhow when he was dining at the house." She laughed in her charming way. "The blood's on Mr. Donnythorpe's head, not yours, Rolliter." Rolliter had been in her father's service before she was born, and had followed her as butler when she married. "Thank you, my lady," said he, retiring and leaving her with the list of guests. It was an instructive and at the same time bewildering document. It contained the names of representatives of all the disgruntled and pacifist factions in England. No wonder Edgar dared not face the publicity of a club or restaurant dinner. No wonder he had lied to her about his guests. No wonder he had sent Rolliter to the country without writing out the cards. He wanted to hide the identity of his guests even from his butler. At each name a new shiver went down her back. Lord Trevanion, blatant millionaire little Englander, whom even the radical government of 1906 had joyfully allowed to purchase a peerage so as to get him out of the House of Commons. There were Benskin and Pottinger and Atwater, members of a small parliamentary gang who lost no opportunity of impeding the prosecution of the war. Lady Edna gasped. Finch of the Independent Labour Party. Was Edgar going mad? Samways, MP and Professor of History, pessimistic apostle of German efficiency and preacher of the hopelessness of the Allied struggle. Editors of pacifist organs, Featherstone, the most brilliant, whose cranky brain had made him the partisan of England's enemies all through his journalistic career. Fordyce, snaky in his intellectual conceit, Riordan, dark and suspect. There were others, politicians and publicists, self-proclaimed patriots and war winners, but openly hostile to the government. Altogether the most amazing crew that ever Minister of the Crown delighted to honour. That the ultimate object of this gathering was the overthrow of the government there could be no doubt. How they were going to manage it was another matter. A rabble like that, thought Lady Edna scornfully, could not upset a nervous old lady. It looked rather like a preliminary meeting, held in secrecy, to start the network in which greater personalities should be enmeshed and involved. At any rate, on the part of Edgar Donnythorpe it was black treachery. The more she scanned the list, the more did her soul sicken within her. It seemed intolerable that this pro-German orgy should take place in the house of which she was the mistress, while she remained here, fooled with her little weekend party. She burned with vengeance against her husband. It was 4:30. She stood in the drawing-room, which she had entered a few minutes before, leaving her guests on the lawn, in order to give some trivial order, and twisted the accusing paper in her hands, her lips thin, deep in thought. Presently into her eyes crept a smile of malice, and she went out of the French window and crossed the grass and joined her friends. There were only three, Colonel and Mrs. Barrington and Miss Delamere. A couple of men who had come down had providentially been detained in London. "My dear people," she said, smiling, "the war has spread to Molesford. There's nothing in the house for dinner. There'll be heaps to-morrow, but none to-night." "I'll go down to the river and angle for a roach," said Colonel Barrington. "Or else come with me to town and dine at the Carlton. I'll take you all in the Rolls-Royce. It'll be a lovely run back." "But, my dear, it'll be joy-riding," cried Mrs. Barrington. "It will indeed," said Lady Edna. "But suppose we're held up?" "I'll say I have to see my husband on important political business." "And I'm a soldier on active service," said Colonel Barrington, "and must be fed." "You don't mind, do you?" asked Lady Edna. Mind? Not they. What could be pleasanter on a perfect summer night? Besides, they had not tasted the guilty sweets of joy-riding for many months. It would be an adventure. They started merrily about 6 o'clock. Lady Edna was in gay spirits, as though enjoying a schoolgirl's freak. Through the perfumed leafedness of Streatley, Basildon, Pangbourne, they flew at the high speed of the great car, through Reading and Maidenhead and Slough, through Hounslow and Brentford. Almost 50 miles. As they approached London, Lady Edna said, "Will you think me funny if I look in at Belgrave Square for a minute?" She spoke a word to the chauffeur. A while later, the car swerved to the right from the direct route to Piccadilly, and at 8 o'clock pulled up at the Donnithorpe's house in Belgrave Square. Lady Edna sprang from the car and tripped up the steps. "I'll let myself in with the latchkey," she cried to the chauffeur, who was about to ring the bell. In the hall she threw off her wraps, gave an instinctive tidying touch to her hair before a mirror, and walked, smiling, on her errand. She waved aside the hard stranger men-servants busy with plates outside the dining-room door, and boldly entered. For a second or two no one observed her. Then one or two guests caught sight of the slender figure, stately in her evening gown, and half rose from their chairs. So the attention of all was called to her. Edgar Donnithorpe, sitting at the head of the table with his back to the door, turned and sprang to his feet with a gasp. To stay polite commotion, she laughed and held up her hand. "Oh, please don't anyone get up." Her husband, in white anger, said, "I thought you were at Molesford, Edna. Is anything the matter?" "Only your dinner party," she replied with derisive graciousness. "I happened to be dining in town, and it occurred to me, look in and see that your guests had everything they wanted, especially," she scanned the faces deliberately, "as they are all new to the house." She bowed and withdrew. Her husband threw down his napkin and followed her. Neither spoke till they reached the hall, when they faced each other. "I couldn't make a scene before all those men," he began. "Of course you couldn't. I knew that," she interrupted. "But I'll make one now. By God I will. What do you mean by this outrageous behaviour?" "To queer your game, my friend. I thought it would be amusing to show all your pretty conspirators that the gaff was blown." "I'm free to ask anyone to my own house. I'm master here, and the sooner you learn it the better. Are you aware that you've insulted the whole of my guests?" "I flatter myself I behaved with peculiar courtesy," said Lady Edna. "It's you who are being rude to them. You'd better go back. Are you coming down to Molesford tomorrow?" "No, I'm damned if I am." He flung away from her, then turned. "By God, you shall pay for this." "Willingly. It's worth a lot." He glowered at her impotently. What scene could he make other than one of vulgar recrimination? She had caught him in a domestic lie and a public act of treachery. For the moment his wife had all the weapons. So they stood there in the rosy light of the hall, deadly enemies, she triumphant, radiant in her scornful beauty, he small, thin, foxy, and malignant. Presently, with a laugh, she moved to the front door. "I never thought you particularly clever, Edgar," she said, "but in diplomatic crudity you could give lessons to the Wilhelmstrasse." With which Parthian shot she opened the door and rejoined her friends in the car. "Forgive me, dear people," she said, settling in her place. "I've been having the time of my life." She returned to town with her guests on Monday morning, but did not see her husband till late in the afternoon, when, on his return from the ministry, he found her alone in her sitting-room. "My dear Edna," said he, in a conciliatory tone, "we owe each other a little mutual understanding. It's so undignified to quarrel." She put the book she was reading pages downward on her knee. "Most undignified," she assented. "You were rather under a misapprehension as to Saturday night." "I'm glad to hear it," she said, "for I was going to ask you a question." "What was that?" "Have you sent in your resignation to the Prime Minister?" No, of course not. That's where your error in judgment, if I may be allowed to say so, comes in. I'm aware I couldn't be seen publicly with that crowd. I had to manage a secret meeting, but it was in order to get them on our side. I thought a frank discussion with them might produce good results." "Has it?" "I think so," said he. "Oh, yes, I think so. I'm speaking at Bristol tonight. You'll see from my speech what my position is. I mean to define it unmistakably." "I'm glad to hear it." She turned away, hating him and despising him more than ever. She passed a hideous day, overwhelmed with fears of treason and disaster. They were justified the following morning, when, looking through the newspapers brought to her bedside, she first glanced at and then pored over the leading article in the important daily edited by Fordyce, one of the guests at the amazing dinner party. It was an attack on the government's conduct of the war, based, ostensibly, on the rumours whose inaccuracy Godfrey had begged her to contradict, but, to those with inner knowledge, on the real facts of the plan of the High Command. It was done with diabolical craft. Challenged as to the source of his information, Fordyce could point to the article and defy anyone to prove that he was possessed of any esoteric information at all. It was mere logical deduction from the general trend of the war policy of the Allied military authorities. And yet the shivering woman knew that the scheme had been divulged to Fordyce. How? In terror she sprang from her bed and opened the secret drawer of her desk. The sheet of notepaper was there just as she had left it. For a moment or two she stood, her hand on her breast, laughing in a silly way. Edgar was capable of many things, but not of rifling her private papers. He was capable of betraying the government to Fordyce, but as a minister, she reflected, he would possibly be aware of the scheme. As the Saturday evening host, he had communicated it to Fordyce, possibly to others. But no, that would have been madness. A man does not blacken himself to a dozen men at once. The others he had assembled so as to prepare them, in his underhand, insinuating way, for this masterstroke. She closed the secret drawer with an impatient snap, and went about the room clenching her hands and uttering futile words. The villain, the infernal villain! No. Life with him henceforth was impossible. She would break away. She had her house at Molesford, her own income. As for her London life, she could take a suite at Claridge's. In the indignant moment she almost forgot Godfrey. Loathing of Edgar overspread all other thoughts. Suddenly she remembered his Bristol speech and ran through the Times to find the report. Condensed, it contained nothing but the facile, uninspired claptrap that had characterized his public utterances since the beginning of his career. He was lying to the country which he had set out to betray. Meanwhile, so her excited fancy told her, he was a peril running loose about the world. What could she do? Drive off then and there and denounce him to the Prime Minister? He would certainly ask her why she connected the leader in the Morning Gazette with the dinner party given to her husband's political opponents. Whence did she derive her knowledge that anything more than conjecture underlay the criticism in Fordyce's paper? And she would not have a word to say. Once again she opened the drawer and took out Godfrey's notes. Better destroy them. Her fingers met in the middle of the sheet, prepared to tear. Then she paused. No. She thought of Sir Berkeley Prynne, a man of unstained honour in private and public life. She would go to him, this in her hand, tell the whole story, and ask his advice. She thrust the paper back into the drawer, rang for her maid, and dressed. A busy woman's correspondence kept her occupied all the morning. At 12:30 came a telephone call from Godfrey. "When and where can I see you? Something most important." "Oh, darling, what is it?" Her voice shook. "Where are you?" "War Office. I can't tell you anything over the phone. Besides, I haven't a minute. I'll be free in about half an hour." "Come round here. I shall be alone." "Right." He switched off, leaving her in throbbing suspense. Naturally, he was coming to her about the Morning Gazette article. To her excited fancy, the whole War Office was in a state of blind ferment, like an ant-heap bombed with a drop of kerosene. His tone, too, had been brusque, imperious, that of a man dealing with crisis. She wished she had gone at once in search of Sir Berkeley Prynne, instead of wasting her morning over correspondence. Still, when one is chairman and treasurer of practical concerns, their business has to be attended to. She went on with her work, her eyes on the little agate clock in front of her. The rattle of a car, a moment of horrible waiting. Rossiter at the door. "Captain Baltazar, my lady." They stood for a breathless second until the butler had closed the door behind him. Then he strode up and caught her in his arms. When she could collect herself, she looked into his dancing, triumphant eyes. A wave of relief swept through her. Suddenly she caught the echo, as it were, of Rodditer's announcement. "Captain?" "Yes, and more than that, I'm going to France." She felt herself grow pale. "My dear." "It's a great stunt," he said exultantly. "Northby has got an army corps. He wants me on his staff. I'm going out as the brainy one with a step in rank. Old man Widdows talked to me as if I were an infant Hague. You could have knocked me down with a bunch of straw." "I'm so glad, dear. I'm so glad you've got what you want." "By God, yes," said he, all aglow. "It's the best thing a one-footed cripple has done up to now. The W.O. isn't the real thing. Out there it is. As soon as I met you I swore I'd make good. To be worthy of you, if such a thing is possible." "I'm a proud woman," said Lady Edna. "But I don't understand. General Northby, I never heard." "Of course you didn't. Neither did I. It was all secrecy and suddenness." He explained roughly the circumstances. "And when do you go out?" "In 3 days' time. I'm on leave till then." "3 days?" She looked at him aghast. "And then you go away indefinitely?" She paused, drew a long breath or two, and sank limply into a chair. He looked at her rather wonderingly. "What about me, Godfrey?" In the gratification of his wildest boyish ambitions, he had forgotten her woman's point of view. He had expected her to share his elation. Remorseful, he bent quickly over her, reddening and stammering. He was a selfish brute. Did he really matter so much to her? If she would but say the word, he would go straight back and refuse the appointment. "Don't talk like a child," she said. "If you did such a thing, we should despise each other for the rest of our lives. But 3 days, only 3 days, and at my wit's end with unhappiness." He sank, lover-like, by her side and took her hand. What was wrong? "Have you seen the Morning Gazette?" He laughed. "Oh, yes, there's a hell of a hullabaloo. But the beauty of it is that the whole thing went fut 3 or 4 days ago. I can't tell you why. We're working out quite a different plan. All the same, there's loud cursing in the camp." He looked at her with one of his swift man's glances. "Of course, dearest, I'm bound to ask. You never breathed a word to anybody of what I told you?" "Not a word." "And you destroyed that paper at once?" "Of course." The lie was out before she realized it. Well, it didn't matter. The thing was obsolete. She would tear it up. No, she wouldn't. She still had to wage her war against her husband with the aid of Sir Berkeley Prynne, and the document would be of great value. "It was he who gave it away to the editor of the Morning Gazette," she said vindictively. "But how the deuce could he have known?" asked Godfrey. "These things are dead secrets. They never go beyond the Army Council." "He did know, anyhow. I've not seen you since. I've a lot to tell you." She told him. He scrambled to his feet. "My God, what a swine! You must leave him." I'm going to hound him out of public life." "And then?" "It's for you to say." An hour later, Godfrey ran down the steps of the house in Belgrave Square, his head in a whirl. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. Baltazar and Quong Ho were finishing lunch when Godfrey, flushed and excited, burst in with his news. An enthusiastically sympathetic parent failed to detect an unusual note, almost one of vainglory, in the boy's speech and manner. He vaunted his success, proclaimed his entry on a brilliant career. He talked wildly. This was to be a war to end war? A maudlin visionary's dream. We might crush the Hun this time and have a sort of peace, a rotten politician's peace, but the Hun would apply himself to the intensive cultivation of hate, and in 20 years at the latest would have another go at frightfulness. And that's where the modern scientific soldier would come in. That was his career. He saw it all before him. And Balthazar, led away by the boy's bright promise, clapped both his hands on his shoulders in a powerful grip, and cried, "I'm proud of you! My God, I'm proud of you! You and I will make our name famous again, as it was in the days of Admiral de Coligny. We'll do things. We'll make this rocking old Europe hum." He laughed, and fire leaped into his eyes. "It's going to be alive these days." "It is. It's glorious," replied Godfrey. Quong Ho, smiling, urbane, approached with outstretched hand. "I hope I may be allowed to offer you my sincere congratulations," said he, "although I do not see eye to eye with you in your prognostication of a recrudescence of warfare after the pacification of this present upheaval, yet—" But Godfrey slapped him on the back, interrupting his eloquence. "That's all right, you dear old image. When you get your fellowship, I'll say the same to you." He cut a hunk from a cake on the table and poured out a whisky and soda. "My dear boy," cried Balthazar, darting to the bell, "haven't you lunched? You must have a proper meal." Godfrey restrained him. No, he hadn't time. He must leave London that afternoon for a day or two, and the next 2 or 3 hours would be a mad rush. A shade of disappointment passed over Balthazar's face. "I was hoping we might have a little dinner tonight to celebrate your appointment. Just ourselves, with Marcel and Lady Edna, if she could come." A smile flickered round Godfrey's lips. "Dreadfully sorry, sir," said he. "I'm not my own master. Anyhow, I know Lady Edna's engaged. But my last night, yes, if you will, I'd love it." As soon as he had bolted food and drink, he rushed out. "He must throw some things into a bag," said he. Presently he returned and took hurried leave. Balthazar gripped him by the hand, and God blessed him. At the door, Godfrey nodded to Quong Ho. "Just a word, old chap." Quong Ho followed him into the hall. Balthazar went to the open dining-room window, and presently saw Godfrey clamber into his little two-seater. He waved a hand. "Good luck." "See you on Friday, sir." The car drove off. Quong Ho returned to the dining-room. "I think, sir," said he, "that we have just parted from a happy young man." "If a man's not happy when he gets his heart's desire at 21, said Balthazar, "he'd better apply for transference to another planet. I threw mine away," he added in a tone of reminiscence, "wilfully. I ought to have been senior wrangler. But I was a fool. I was always taking false steps. That's the wonderful thing about Godfrey Quong Ho, as doubtless you've noticed. He always takes the right steps. A marvellously well-balanced mind." He smiled in a meditative way, thanking heaven for sparing Godfrey those storms of temperament in which he had so often suffered shipwreck. A steady chap, disciplined, not to be turned out of his course. "Well, well," said he, "now from refreshment to labour. Come upstairs and let us get on with the work." It was the long vacation, and Quong Ho, tireless and devoted, was replacing Balthazar's secretary, absent on a much-needed holiday. A busy afternoon lay before them. That evening the week's number of the New Universe must go to press. The final proofs be passed, modifying footnotes added to bring statements and arguments up to the hour's date, so swift were the kaleidoscopic variations of the confused world condition, and Balthazar's own additional summary, the dynamo of the powerful periodical, had to be finished. They sat in Balthazar's library, at the orderly piled writing-table, very much as they had sat, a year ago, in the scholarly room at Spendale Farm. But now no longer as master and humorously treated pupil. The years of training had borne excellent fruit, and Quong Ho proved himself to be an invaluable colleague. So much so that Balthazar at times cursed the University of Cambridge for depriving him, for the greater part of the year, of one of the most subtle brains in the kingdom. Quong Ho could point unerringly to a fallacy in an argument. He seemed to be infallible on questions of fact in war politics, and such a meticulously accurate proof-corrector had never been born. In such a light at least did his rara avis appear to Balthazar. They worked in silence, Balthazar furiously inditing his article, Quong Ho, pen in hand, intent on the proofs. The open window admitted the London sounds of the warm summer afternoon. Presently Balthazar rose and cast off coat and waistcoat, and with a sigh of relief at the coolness of shirt-sleeves, sat down again. "Why don't you do the same?" Quong Ho, impeccably attired in a dark suit and a high stiff collar, replied that he did not feel the heat. "I believe it would hurt you not to be prim and precise," said Balthazar. "I wonder what would happen if you really ever let yourself go." Quong Ho smiled blandly. "I have been taught, sir, that self-discipline is the foundation of all virtue." Balthazar laughed. "You're young. Stick to it. I've had as much as is good for me at my time of life. I'm going to end my days, thank God, in delightful lack of restraint. I'm going to let myself go, my friend, over this new job, like a runaway horse. At last I've bullied them into giving me a free hand. To change from a year ago, isn't it?" I agree that the change has been most beneficent, said Quong Ho. Yes, by Jove, cried Balthazar. Then we were just a couple of grubby bookworms doing nothing for ourselves or our fellow creatures. Now, here you are dealing with thoughts that shake the world, and I, by Jove, one of the leading men in England. I should like to see the bomb that would knock us out this time. He hitched up his shirt cuffs and plunged again into his article. He had scarcely written a sentence when the door opened and Marcel appeared on the threshold. He pushed back his chair and rose and advanced to her with both hands outstretched. "Hello, hello! What has blown you in at this time of day?" She looked up at him as she took his hand, and he saw there was trouble in her eyes. "I know I'm disturbing you, but I can't help it," she said quickly. "I must speak to you." "Perhaps you would like to speak with Mr. Baltazar in private," said Quong Ho. "Indeed I should, Mr. Ho. Please forgive me." Quong Ho bowed and retired. Balthazar drew a chair for her. "Now what's wrong, my dear?" "Godfrey." "My God!" he cried. "Not an accident. He's not hurt?" "Oh, no, nothing of that sort." She smiled in wan reassurance. Balthazar breathed relief. "I believe if anything happened to him now, it would break me," he said. "He came round to see me an hour or so ago." "After he left here, to tell you of his appointment? Aren't you glad?" "Of course I am, but I should be more glad if that had been all." "What's up?" he asked, frowning. "Tell me straight." "Ought I to tell you?" she asked rather piteously. "It's betraying his confidence shamefully. I know I'm to blame. I ought never to have given him my promise. But I can't see him go and ruin everything without making some sacrifice." "My dearest Marcel, you're talking in riddles. For heaven's sake, give me the word of the enigma." "It's Lady Edna Donnithorpe." "Well, what about her?" "I wish he'd never set eyes on the woman," she cried passionately. "If he's in love with her, he'll have to get over it," said Balthazar. "France will cure him, and as I told you the other evening, the lady's perfectly callous. So, my dear, go along and don't worry." "You don't seem to understand me, John dear," she said urgently. "The woman is in love with him. It has been going on for months. He's told me all about it. She gets up and goes out driving with him in the car at 8 o'clock in the morning." "Silly woman," growled Balthazar. "Silly or not, she wouldn't do it if she didn't care for him. Not Lady Edna Donnithorpe. They meet whenever they can. He comes to me and pours out everything. I ought to have told you, but I couldn't break my word. They're lovers." "Lovers? What do you mean?" he asked, bending his heavy brows. "Not yet. Not in that sense, I'm sure, but they soon will be." She looked at him anxiously. "I know I'm going to forfeit Godfrey's affection and perhaps your respect, but I can't do otherwise." She paused, then burst out desperately. "She's going to run away with him this afternoon." "The devil she is!" cried Balthazar. He strode about the room and threw up his hands. "Oh, the damned young fool!" He wheeled round on Marcel. "Why on earth didn't you stop it?" She pleaded helplessness. How could she? Naturally, she had used every argument, moral and worldly. As it was, he had dashed off in a fume, calling her unsympathetic and narrow-minded, regretting that he had ever given her his confidence. He had promised long ago to let her know everything. Now that he had kept his word, she turned against him. She had been powerless. "He's old enough to look after his own morals," said Balthazar, "and I'm not the silly hypocrite to hold up my hands in horror. But to go and run away with the most notorious society woman in London and play the devil with his career is another matter. Oh, the damned young fool! That rat Edgar Donnithorpe will get on to it at once. He's just the man to stick at nothing. A filthy divorce case. The boy'll have to resign if he doesn't get chucked. Then marry the woman 5 years older than himself. Where's the happiness going to be?" He resumed his striding about the room in his impetuous way, and Marcel followed him timidly with her eyes. "Oh, damnation!" said he. He had just been lecturing Quong Ho on Godfrey's steadiness and balance. Why, he himself had never done such a scatterbrained thing. "Where are the precious pair going?" "A remote week-end cottage," she said, "belonging to a complacent friend of Lady Edna's. 5 miles from station, post office or shop. A lonely Eden in the wilderness. Whether it was north, east, south or west of London she did not know. An old woman in charge would look after them." "I suppose they're well on their way by now," said he. "I don't know. Possibly not. He said he had to rush about town to order his kit. Besides," she added hopelessly, "what does it matter when they start?" Balthazar cursed in futile freedom. "There's nothing I wouldn't give for it not to have happened," he exclaimed. "I suppose I was a fool. You warned me. And it was I who, like an ass, encouraged them. I could kick myself." "It's like you, John, dear, not to blame me," she said humbly. "Of course I don't blame you. You thought it boyish folly. What's the good of talking about it?" They did talk, however, in a helpless way. "They had no intention of doing anything desperate," she said, "until this morning. If he had remained in London, they might have gone on indefinitely. The prospect of endless months in France set the whole thing ablaze. When I put the moral side before him, he retorted with a tu quoque." "What did he mean?" "That I was ready at his age to run away with a married man." "Were you?" he asked. "I suppose so," she replied, with a weary little smile. "That was an entirely different affair." "Not from the moral point of view." "Oh, damn morals," said he. She laughed in spite of her distress. It was so characteristic of the man. If anything got in his way, he just damned it and regarded it as non-existent. He moved restlessly about. Then, catching sight of his discarded coat and waistcoat, plunged savagely into them, as though he were going in pursuit of the erring pair. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, abandoning halfway the furious buttoning of his waistcoat. "That's the devil. There's nothing to be done." At that moment, Quong Ho discreetly appeared at the door. "Will you have particular need of my services for the next hour?" "Yes, of course I shall. Look there." Balthazar flung a hand towards the paper-strewn table. "We go to press this evening." Quong Ho consulted his watch. "I am sorry, then, for I don't know how I shall proceed. I promised Captain Godfrey to take his bag to the railway station at 5 o'clock. Smiles wreathed Balthazar's face of annoyance, and he exchanged a quick glance with Marcel. "What railway station?" "Waterloo." "I thought he had taken his kit with him in the car." "He explained, sir, when he called me into the hall before he left, that he couldn't garage the car at Waterloo station." "I see," said Balthazar. "Therefore I am to seek it in his bedroom and convey it by taxi to Waterloo." Balthazar nodded approvingly, and the humorous light appeared in his eyes which Quong Ho could never interpret. "It's very lucky you told me, Quong Ho. I want particularly to say a word or two to Godfrey before he leaves London. I'll take his bag. You get on with the work. Perhaps you'll send somebody out for a taxi." "I'll fetch one myself," said Quong Ho, and bowing as usual politely to Marcel, left the room. Balthazar clutched her arms with both hands and lifted her from her seat, and laughing exultantly, kissed her a hearty, unintelligible kiss, the first for 20 years, leaving her utterly bewildered. "The Lord has delivered them into my hands," he cried. "The stars in their courses fight for the house of Baltazar." "What in the world are you going to do?" she asked. "Play hell," said he. 10 minutes afterwards, Balthazar was speeding eastwards, grimly smiling. By skilful contrivance, he had dispatched the helpful Quong Ho upstairs to Marcel at the last moment, and had pitched Godfrey's kit into the dining-room, and had driven off without it. If the infatuated youth would not listen to reason, or the lady to the plainest of speech, he could go off to his love in a cottage unromantically destitute of toothbrush and pyjamas. Ridicule kills. The boy would hate him for the moment, but would assuredly live to bless him. Once in France, he would have no time for folly. The imperious man's thoughts flew fast. The lady herself should cure the boy. He would see to that. If he couldn't break an Edna Donnithorpe, bring her to heel, he was not John Balthazar. In his jealousy for the boy's honourable career, he swept the woman's possible emotions into the limbo of inconsiderable things. What kind of a woman was she anyhow to have married a rat like Donnithorpe? He read her in rough intolerance. Just a freak of thwarted sex. That was it. If nothing was discovered, she would return to her normal life, and, sizing up the episode in a cold, intellectual way, would discover that the game was not worth the candles supplied by the old woman in the remote cottage, and would send Godfrey packing to any kind of Byronic despair. If the intrigue came out and there was a divorce and subsequent marriage, there would be the devil to pay. The taxi clattered through the gloomy archway approaches at Waterloo, and drew up at the end of the long line of cabs at the entrance to the station. The summer exodus from London was just beginning, and the outside platform was abustle with porters, trucks, passengers, and luggage. Balthazar, after paying his fare, lingered for a moment at the great door of the booking-hall, and then entered and passed through it into the hurrying station. A queue stood at the suburban ticket office. He scanned it, but no Godfrey. He walked the length of the platform entrances, through the crowds of passengers and their dumps of luggage and knots of soldiers, some about to entrain, sitting on the ground with their packs around them, others newly arrived on leave, Australians with their soft hats, wiry cockneys still encased in the clay of the trenches, officers of all grades and of all arms. Presently, at the central bookstall, turning away, his arms full of periodicals, Godfrey came into view. Balthazar approached, smiling. His son's face darkened. "I didn't expect to see you here, sir. If you want to study the ways of a country, there's nothing like its great railway stations. They're a favourite haunt of mine." "It's rather stuffy under this glass roof, don't you think?" said Godfrey. "I don't mind it, dear boy," replied Balthazar cheerfully. "But it's lucky I hit upon Waterloo. I shall be able to see you off. By the way, where are you going?" "Somewhere Southampton way, sir," said Godfrey stiffly. "Lot of light literature," remarked Balthazar, motioning to the periodicals. "Quite a debauch," said Godfrey. Balthazar's quick eyes picked out the board by the Southampton platform. "Your train, I see, goes at 5:45. You're a bit early." "Yes, sir, it's such a long time till the train starts that I couldn't think of asking you to wait." "That doesn't matter a bit, my dear boy. Time is no object." "I'm very sorry to be rude, sir, but as a matter of fact, I have an appointment," said Godfrey desperately. "An important appointment." "Oh," said Balthazar. "And if you don't mind, I must wait outside the station. Quong Ho is bringing my suitcase. I shouldn't like to miss him." He made a step forward, but an ironic glitter in his father's searching eyes arrested the moment. "Quong Ho isn't bringing your suitcase. I've come instead." Godfrey drew himself up haughtily. "I don't understand. Have you been kind enough to bring my luggage?" "No," replied Balthazar calmly. "It's on the floor of the dining room." "Your interference with my arrangements, sir, is unwarrantable," said the boy, pale with anger. "Possibly, unless we adopt the Jesuitical principle of the end justifying the means." "And what is the end, might I ask?" "To prevent you from making an infernal fool of yourself." The young man regarded him inimically. Balthazar felt a throb of pride in his attitude, a lad of spirit. "I suppose Marcel came straight to you with my confidence. In giving it to her, I made a fool of myself, I admit. As for what I propose to do, I fail to see that it's any concern of yours." Balthazar's heart yearned over the boy. He said in a softened tone, "It is ruin to your career and a mess-up of your whole life, and your future means so much to me that I'd sacrifice anything, honour, decency, even your affection, which I thought I had gained, to see you off at any rate to France with a clean sheet." But Godfrey, in cold wrath, did not heed the pleading note. He'd been betrayed and tricked. Only his soldier's training kept him outwardly calm. To the casual glances of the preoccupied crowd passing by them, nothing in the demeanour of either man gave occasion for special interest. They stood, too, in a little islet of space apart from the general stream of traffic. Balthazar went on with his parable. He had not the heart to hint his projected jibe at the unromantic lack of toothbrushes. Things ran too deep. "I admit none of your arguments," said Godfrey at last. "Besides, I am my own master. I owe you a debt for many kindnesses. Your affection, I don't undervalue it. But there things end. After all, we met a year ago as strangers. I've run my life as I chose, and I mean to run it as I choose. I expect Lady Edna to arrive at any minute. In common delicacy, I must ask you to let me go my own ways." "All right, go," said Balthazar, "but I'll go with you." Godfrey's eyes flamed. "You wouldn't dare." "My dear fellow," said Balthazar, "I don't think there's a damn thing in the world that I wouldn't dare. Haven't you found that out?" So they stood there for a while longer, talking in their little islet beneath the glass roof of the busy station, and the boy's heart was filled with anger and wild hatred of the thick-shouldered, smiling man with the powerful face and infernal dancing eyes. Then suddenly Balthazar strode away at a great pace, and Godfrey, turning, saw that he was cutting off Lady Edna, who had entered, preceded by a porter wheeling her luggage. Before he had time to overtake him, Balthazar was already taking off his hat to an amazed lady, and had imperiously checked the porter. "Lady Edna," said he, "I'm here to prevent Godfrey and yourself from committing the insanity of your lives." She said, mistress of herself, "I don't understand you, Mr. Balthazar. You seem to be taking an outrageous liberty. I'm going to stay at the house of a friend who has asked Godfrey to be my fellow guest." Before Balthazar could reply, Godfrey came hurrying up with his slight limp and plunged into angry explanations. She looked at the clock. "If you telephone home now," she said coolly, "a servant will have ample time to bring your things." "By God, yes," said Godfrey, angrily depositing the sheaf of periodicals on her luggage. "Have you got the tickets?" "Of course." He marched away across the station. "Porter," said Lady Edna. But no porter was there, for, unperceived by either of the lovers, Balthazar had slipped 5 shillings into the man's hand and told him to come back later. "There's heaps of time," said Balthazar. "Now, my dearest lady, what is the good of make-believe? Cards on the table. You're going to make a bolt with Godfrey and throw your cap over the windmills. There's a nice little cottage in a wood, in the depths of the New Forest, I presume, lent to you by a friend who is represented by one solitary old woman." "How do you know that?" she asked, her soft eyes hardening in their characteristic way. "Godfrey has surely not been such a—" She paused for a word. "Well, such an imbecile as to tell you?" "Godfrey has told me nothing. You may be certain of that. His fury against me is sufficiently obvious." "Then how do you know?" "That's my affair," smiled Balthazar. "Lady Edna," said he, "don't you think that my coming the heavy father like this puts you into rather an absurd position?" She replied, white-lipped, "I'll never forgive you till I'm dead." "I've naturally counted on the consequences of your resentment," said Balthazar. "What do you propose to do?" "If you persist, to thrust upon you the displeasure of my company, without luggage, just like Godfrey." "You—" she began indignantly, and then suddenly, "Oh, my God!" and clutched him by the arm. He followed her stare across the station, and there, in the archway of the booking-hall, peering from right to left in his rat-like way, stood Edgar Donnithorpe. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. "You seem to have managed your little affair rather clumsily," said Balthazar. "What's he doing here?" she asked wildly. "Probably catching you and Godfrey." "He mustn't see Godfrey here." "That's easily managed," said Balthazar. "I'll send him flying out of the telephone box. But what on earth could have put your husband on the track? What indiscretion have you been committing?" "I left a letter for him telling him I wouldn't stay any longer in his house. He's a traitor to his country." Balthazar threw up his hands. "Oh, Lord, the usual idiocy. For a clever woman, well. Anyhow, I'll head off, Godfrey. When your husband spots you, use your brains. Don't say a word to give yourself away." "You'll come back?" she cried, losing her head. "I'll see," said he. He left her and fetched a compass round the station, mingling as much as possible with the never-ceasing throng of soldiers and civilians and women and luggage, until he arrived at the row of telephone boxes. There he found Godfrey, waiting his turn and fuming at the delay. "My boy," said he, "here are all the elements of a first-class farce. The injured husband, Edgar Donnithorpe, has turned up. You'd better make tracks as quick as you can." "I suppose you gave him the hint," snarled the young man with set teeth. "You're insulting your own blood to make such a damn-fool remark," said Balthazar. "Go home and stay there till I come." Godfrey met the infernal eyes, and for all his anger and humiliation, knew that he had accused basely. "I apologize, sir," said he, in his most haughty and military manner, and marched off. Balthazar hesitated. Should he or should he not return to Lady Edna? If he had escaped the eye of Edgar Donnithorpe, it were better to leave Lady Edna, injured, innocent, to tell her tale of solitary retirement to sylvan depths where she could be remote from the consequences of his political turpitude. On the other hand, if he had been observed, or if Lady Edna had avowed his presence, his abandonment of her might be idiotically interpreted. He decided to return. He saw them at once through the moving traffic, the husband, his back towards him, gripping a handle of the truck on which the luggage was piled, the wife facing him, an ironical smile on her lips. A devilish handsome woman, thought Balthazar. The boy had taste. There she stood, slim, distinguished in her simple fawn coat and skirt and little hat to match, beneath which waved her dark brown hair, very cool, aristocratic, and defiant. Balthazar came up to them. "Ah, Donnithorpe." The thin grey man wheeled round, and then Balthazar realized that he had made the wrong decision, for he was the last man the other expected to see. "You? What are you doing here?" he shouted. "Hush," said Lady Edna, with a touch on his arm. "You're not at home or in the House of Commons. You're in a public place, and you'll get a crowd round us in no time. Let us pretend we're a merry party going on holiday." Edgar Donnithorpe threw an anxious glance round to see if they had attracted undesired attention. But people passed them by or stood in knots near them, unheeding, intent on their own affairs. "I ask you," he said in a low voice, "what you are doing at this railway station with my wife?" Balthazar, his felt hat at the back of his head, and his hands thrust into his trousers pockets beneath the skirts of his buttoned-up, double-breasted jacket, eyed him in exasperating amusement. "I'm seeing Lady Edna off on a railway journey. Was it necessary to ask your permission?" Lady Edna laughed mockingly. "As far as I can make out, my husband expected to find me eloping with your son Godfrey." Donnithorpe shifted his eyes from one to the other, looking at them evilly. "He was with you for nearly a couple of hours today. I have my own very good reasons for suspicions. I went round to your house, Mr. Balthazar, and asked for your son. I saw your Chinese secretary." He caught Balthazar's involuntary sudden frown and angry flush. "In justice," he continued in his thin, sneering manner, "I must absolve him from indiscretion. He knows my position in the government, and when I informed him that it was imperative I should see your son on important political business, he told me I should find him at Waterloo Station." "You overreached yourself," said Balthazar with a bantering grin. "Godfrey knows no more about politics than a tomcat. Quong Ho naturally thought you meant me. You came. Here I am, seeing your wife off. She telephoned me that she was leaving your house, going to stay with friends, wanted a man of the world's advice on the serious step she was taking. Womanlike, of course, she took the step first and asked for advice afterwards, and I naturally put myself at her ladyship's disposal. Don't you think you'd better let Lady Edna get on with her journey? Here's her porter. Come with me and see her safe into her carriage." He was enjoying himself amazingly. Donnithorpe, baffled, tugged at his thin grey moustache. The porter came up, touching his cap. "Time's getting on, ma'am. I've reserved the 2 seats." "One seat," said Lady Edna swiftly. "Beg your pardon, ma'am. I thought you said the gentleman was going with you." "1 seat. I said I was meeting a gentleman." The porter wheeled off the luggage. Lady Edna turned to follow, but her husband gripped her viciously by the wrist. "Not yet." "Drop that," growled Balthazar. Donnithorpe released her, plunged his hand into his breast-pocket, and drew out a couple of sheets of paper. "You did say 2 seats. You meant to go off with him. There's some damned trickery about it. But I've got the whip hand, my lady. Just look at this before you go." Lady Edna turned ghastly white, and clutched Balthazar's arm to steady herself from the sickening shock. In the desperate rush, after Godfrey's departure, the scheming, the packing, the telephoning, the temporary straightening of affairs, the chase over London for the complacent friend whose connivance was essential, the eagerness to get free of the house before her husband should return, she had forgotten the scrap of paper in her secret drawer with its obsolete information. Now the horror flashed on her. Her husband had gone to the drawer before. Hence the article in Fordyce's paper. Her first instinct had been right. He had gone to the drawer again. Her swaying brain wondered how he had discovered the secret of the spring, but he had found the paper which in her folly she had not destroyed. And what else besides? She heard, as in a dream, her husband saying, "If he isn't your lover, what about these? Here's proof. Here's a matter of court-martial and jail." She regained her self-control with a great effort, still holding to Balthazar. "You hound," she whispered. Balthazar, smitten with the realization that comedy had vanished, the comedy in which he played so debonair and masterly a part, vanished in the flash of a cinematographic film, and that something very near tragedy was staring him in the face, stretched out his hand for the papers. "Let me see." But Donnithorpe smiled his thin, derisive smile. "No, they're too precious. I'll hold them for you to look at. Keep away." And there, in the airless, glass-roofed railway station, on that hot summer afternoon, in the midst of the reverberating noises of trains letting off steam, of 1,000 human voices, of scurrying feet, of grating luggage trunks, in the midst of a small town's moving and lounging population, surging now at that hour's height of the suburban traffic with home-going streams. There, with hundreds of eyes to watch them, hundreds of ears to hear them, hundreds of successive ears of people darting bee-like around the busy bookstall not 10 yards away, there 3 quietly talking human beings stood at grips with destiny. "This is written on your notepaper. It is a War Office secret. It reveals the whole strategy of the High Command." Balthazar's lips grew grim, and his eyes, bent on the little man, burned like fires. In Donnithorpe's hands the document was Godfrey's death warrant. Then Balthazar remembered the shock he had received in Sheepshanks's room at Cambridge when first he saw a letter of Godfrey's, and Godfrey's after explanation of the identity of their handwriting. "Don't you see? It gives the whole thing away," Donnithorpe continued. "I'm quite aware of it," said Balthazar. "I drew it up for your wife." "You?" exclaimed Donnithorpe in incredulous amazement, while Lady Edna caught a sharp breath and clung more fiercely to Balthazar's arm. "Where did you get the information from?" "I am to be the minister of the new department in a day or two," said Balthazar, "and I'm in the inner confidence of the War Cabinet." "But it's your son's handwriting." "It's my handwriting," said Balthazar calmly. He drew from his pocket a sheaf of notes for a speech and handed them to Donnithorpe. "Compare, if you like." Donnithorpe returned them with a curious thin snarl and held out the other paper. "And you wrote this too?" Balthazar glanced at it. It was the first sheet of a letter from which the other sheet had been torn. Lady Edna saw it and again swayed, half fainting with sickening humiliation. The only one of Godfrey's letters, and only part of one, which she had kept. 2 pages breathing such a passionate love as she had never dreamed that a man in real life could express to woman. She had forgotten that she had left that, too, in the secret drawer. She stared haggardly into Balthazar's face. His lips twisted into a smile. "Yes, I wrote that, too," said he. "Then you're a damned villain!" cried Donnithorpe. "Very possibly," said Balthazar. Donnithorpe turned in his rat-like way to his wife. "What have you to say about it?" Suddenly recovered from her fit of terror and shame, she withdrew her grip from Balthazar's arm and held herself up with the scornful poise of her head. "Nothing," she said. "You can flatter yourself now you know everything." He did not heed her words, but once more looked from one to the other with a thin, chuckling laugh. "You're a pretty pair, you, my lady, and you, Mr. Minister of Publicity. It strikes me you'll have to postpone your elopement." "You've got elopement on the brain, my good fellow," said Balthazar. "A Minister of Publicity doesn't elope with a lady with nothing but what he stands up in. Where's my luggage?" "There," replied Donnithorpe, pointing to the barriers to the platform. "Didn't the porter say she'd ordered 2 seats, one for a gentleman?" "This is getting wearisome," said Lady Edna. "I've already told you how the mistake arose." The solicitous porter, already rewarded with 5 shillings, and belonging to a race as richly endowed with human failings as any others in the world, hurried up. "I found a corner seat, ma'am. Put everything in the carriage. You've not much time left." Suddenly she became aware of the awful desolation that awaited her in the remote cottage in the New Forest, with one horrible old servant woman for company. Within, her feminine unreason clamoured. No, no. She revolted against the grotesque absurdity of such comfortless living burial. She would go mad, cut off from every opportunity of hearing instant developments of this nerve-wracking situation. She couldn't stick it. "I've changed my mind, porter. I'm not going. Get my things out and bring them back." "Certainly, ma'am." The porter ran off. Balthazar thrust his hands again into his trousers pockets. His face was a grim mask. "Why don't you get your luggage out too?" sneered Donnithorpe. "Don't be a brainless fool," said Balthazar. The fingers in his pockets twitched, and Lady Edna caught a malevolent flash in his eyes that made her shiver. He would have liked to wring her neck. Why the devil didn't she play the game and go to the cottage and the old woman? He read her through and through, and mingled with his contempt ran a thrill of gladness. Godfrey was well rid of her. Donnithorpe cackled at his abjuration. He turned to Lady Edna. "You haven't condescended to tell me where you were going." "I was going, if you wanted to know, to stay with Sybil Manning at her little place in the New Forest." "Indeed," said her husband in his rasping voice, and a gleam of triumph sparkled in his crafty eyes. "Now it happens that I, not being quite the fool you and Mr. Baltazar have thought me, rang up Lady Manning. It was the first thing I did when I read your letter. I knew you would bolt straight to her. I've often thought of bringing in a bill in Parliament to deprive her of existence. She asked me herself. She had heard nothing of you, knew nothing of you." "Naturally," she said jeeringly. "But," she added, carrying the war into the enemy's quarters, "she knows everything about you. Everything, my friend. So will the Prime Minister." "I was with the Prime Minister this morning," said Donnithorpe. "I told him all about my Saturday evening's effort in the cause of solidarity. We parted the best of friends, and my position is secure." "What about Fordyce's article this morning?" "This morning I couldn't conceive how the fellow had got the information. This evening, or tomorrow morning," he tapped his breast pocket, "if I am asked, I can point to a dual source of leakage." He folded his arms, the crafty political intriguer, thin and triumphant. "Of us two," said Balthazar, "it strikes me that you are the damnedest scoundrel." "What you think is a matter of perfect indifference to me," retorted Donnithorpe. "What does interest me is the fact that my wife was going to stay with Lady Manning in the New Forest, while Lady Manning is in London, and that when I find her here with you, she decides not to go to the New Forest after all." Lady Edna flushed angrily. She was outmanoeuvred, outclassed, beaten on all sides by the thin grey man whom she despised. She had acted like a brainless, immoral schoolgirl. "Where do you propose to go now?" asked Donnithorpe. She spat her venom at him. "Anywhere to get out of the sight of you. Yes, I was going alone to Sybil Manning's cottage. I just left her when you telephoned. I wanted to get as far away from you as I could, and from the disgusting impressions of the last few days. Now the whole thing would be spoiled by this abominable insult. I shall stay with my mother tonight, and go down to Mulsford tomorrow." "I'm glad," replied Donnithorpe acidly. "You're not thinking of returning to my house. I'm not going to have any plea of condemnation." Lady Edna moved away haughtily towards the barriers. "I see my porter. Mr. Baltazar, will you kindly put me in a taxi?" "No, he shan't. You shall go in my car." Balthazar, in a cold fury, stood over him threateningly. "You stay here," said he, "or by the living God I'll half kill you." He caught up Lady Edna and followed with her in the wake of the porter. She said, "I owe you a debt of gratitude which I can't ever repay." He felt merciless towards her, murderous. "You let that boy alone, do you hear? You've come within a hair's breadth of blasting his life. It remains yet to be seen whether that hair's breadth will save him." "I'll do anything in my power," she began. "For God's sake stop doing things. Hold your tongue. You've been criminal in your piling folly on folly. You've done enough." "But you—" "I can take care of myself and the boy, if you keep quiet. You've got to remember the position. I'm your lover, avowed before your husband by both of us, you implicitly. You're not to lose sight of that fact. Understand? If you hold any communication with Godfrey, you'll get him court-martialed, disgraced, probably imprisoned. And then, by God, I won't have any pity on you." Talking thus, they reached the outer platform of the station, and waited while the porter secured a taxi. She whispered, for they were brushed by the throng of passengers arriving and departing. "If Edgar brings a divorce action, he's vindictive." "He'll bring no action if you stop playing the fool. I'd advise you not to interfere with my game." The porter swung from the step of the taxi, bringing a new arrival, and as soon as the latter, a young officer with a suitcase, had alighted and paid his fare, he piled in Lady Edna's belongings. She entered the cab, very white and scared. Godfrey had told her enough about his father for her to realize the unyielding nature of the man. She was terrified, cowed. He blazed before her irresistibly elemental. She carried away with her a blurred impression of his thatch of brown hair, coarse and strong, like the crown of some relentless beast, as he lifted his hat when the taxi drove off. She shuddered and hated him. Balthazar let himself into the house in Sussex Gardens and went straight to Godfrey's room. He found him writing hard. When the young man sprang up, his quiet eye noted the desk strewn with many sheets of notepaper. "Writing to her, I suppose?" "It's not altogether unnatural," Godfrey replied in stiff hostility. "Where are you going to address it?" Godfrey, looking into the infernal eyes, saw that it was not an idle and impertinent question. Besides, he had spent a very agitated hour, gnawed by bitter disappointment and impotent anger, and torturing his brain with conjecture as to what had happened. "Where is Lady Edna, sir?" he asked. "She's gone to stay with Lady Ralston." "Her mother?" "The Dowager Countess of Ralston is, I believe, her mother," said Balthazar. He threw himself into a chair and mopped his forehead. "Why the devil don't you open a window?" "I didn't notice," said Godfrey, and went and threw up the sash. It was a cosy room at the back of the house, the smoking den of the late dead owner, furnished with green leather armchairs, drawn up at each end of a green leather-covered fender seat, with a great green leather-cushioned Chesterfield, with solid, comfortable mahogany tables, writing desk, and bookcases. On the walls hung well-framed old engravings of solid worth, and Godfrey had added a little armoury of war trophies, Hun helmets, rifles, flare pistols, gas masks, bayonets, gleaming shell cases of all sizes, a framed blood-stained letter or two in German script. A cosy room more suitable for a winter's evening than a close summer afternoon. Balthazar filled his lungs with the fresher air. "That's better," said he. Godfrey stood by the fireplace, his face set and unyielding. "Perhaps you might tell me, sir, what has happened. What brought Donnithorpe to the station?" "The hope of catching you, my son, in flagrante delicto of elopement." "Quong Ho was sure that he wanted you." "Quong Ho made a mistake. Donnithorpe was exceedingly surprised to find me." There was a long pause, during which Balthazar bent his disconcerting and luminous gaze on the young man. "Godfrey," he said at last, "what made you such an infatuated fool as to give away War Office secrets in writing to that woman?" A look of horror dawned in the young man's eyes, and he took a step forward. He gasped, What do you mean?" And then, when Balthazar described the disastrous paper, he cried passionately, "It can't be! It can't possibly be! Only this morning she told me she had destroyed it." "She lied, my son," said Balthazar. "But she knew it was my honour, my everything." "Of course she did. Do you suppose that matters to her?" Godfrey repeated in a dazed way, "There must be some mistake. She told me she had destroyed it." "Well, she didn't," said Balthazar. "She kept it, to gratify some vanity or ambition, I don't know. Our talk was too concentrated to divagate into motives. Anyway, care for your honour didn't affect her. She left it about, and Edgar Donnithorpe has got it, and means to use it." The distracted young man sat down, his head in his hands, and groaned. "My God, that's the end of me." Balthazar deliberately filled and lit a pipe, and said nothing. Better let the consequences of the lady's betrayal soak in. Presently Godfrey rose to his feet, and his face was haggard. "I'll go to Donnithorpe and get it back. He daren't show it. It'll be accusing himself of giving away the information to the Morning Gazette." But Balthazar held him with his inscrutable eyes. "You're a brilliant soldier, my son, but you're no match for a foxy old politician, a past master of dirty craft. He put himself right with the Prime Minister this morning. Besides, there's the lady to be considered. Not that I think she deserves much consideration. Still, it's a convention of honour." Godfrey flashed. "I'm not going to bring her name into it." "He will. He'll get the whole story out of you." "What the devil am I to do?" asked Godfrey with a helpless gesture. Balthazar rose. "My boy," said he, "in 2 or 3 days' time they're going to make me, a man suddenly sprung from nowhere, a minister of the Crown. That shows I'm not altogether a silly fool." In spite of the welter of disillusion and catastrophe in which the boy foundered, he detected in his father's voice the pathetic, apologetic note which he had never been able to resist, the note conveying his father's yearning desire to make good in his eyes. "You know I'm proud of you, sir," he said, "which is a lot more," he added with a break in his voice, "than you can say of me." Balthazar put his arm round his son's shoulders very tenderly. "My boy," said he, "I give my life for you." And the young man hung his head. "The only thing is, will you trust me?" 10 minutes afterwards, Balthazar, cheery and confident, stood at the door preparing to depart from a chastened, though more hopeful, Godfrey. Love had conquered. What had passed between his father and the Donnithorpes the boy did not know. Of his father's assumption of the part of indiscreet lover he had no suspicion. But his father had fascinated him, dominated his will, evoked in him a blind, unquestioning confidence, compelled from him a promise of implicit obedience. Of course there were conditions. He was to petition the War Office to be allowed to sacrifice his leave and start for France at the earliest opportunity, the next day if possible. He was not to communicate with Lady Edna until his return to England, whenever that might be. He gave the latter undertaking readily, her lie rankling in his heart, her callous disregard of his honour monstrous in its incomprehensibility. Whatever might be his revulsion of feeling afterwards, and his clear young brain grappled with the possibility, whatever might be his unregenerate torment of longing, he accepted the condition as his punishment. She, so his father said, was bound by the same condition. Balthazar stood by the door. "It's all damned hard, old man, I know. But you'll worry through. It's the English way." He walked out, humming Tipperary out of tune, the only modern air he knew, and ascended the stairs and thrust his head into the drawing-room. There, as he expected, he found a desolate Marcel, who, throwing down the book which he was trying to read, jumped up and ran to the door. What had happened? Quong Ho had told her of Edgar Donnithorpe's call. Godfrey was in black anger against her. "Go down," said he, "and make your peace with him. You'll stay and dine. I must go now and finish my work before dinner." He left her, and still humming Tipperary, entered his library, where Quong Ho was patiently and efficiently working at the proofs. "Miss Baring and Captain Godfrey have upbraided me for indiscretion in that I informed Mr. Donnithorpe of your whereabouts," said Quong Ho. "The best day's work you ever did in your life," said Balthazar, seating himself at the table and taking up his pen. The dinner was not quite the success for which Balthazar had hoped, in spite of his efforts to set a tone of light-hearted gaiety. His best champagne flowed to little purpose. Godfrey acknowledged the toast to his promotion and appointment with irreproachable politeness and lamentable lack of fervour. Marcel confessed afterwards that she had never sat through so unjoyous a meal. To make her peace with Godfrey had been no easy matter. It was but an armistice that she had patched up. Twice that day had he been betrayed by women, and he felt sore against an untrustworthy sex. He had admitted her not an inch further into his confidence. Of the incriminating scrap of paper he told her nothing. She sat at the table puzzled and unhappy. Quong Ho ate philosophically when he was not drinking in the words of wisdom that came from the master's lips. They broke up early. Godfrey retired to his room. Quong Ho departed to the printer's to correct the proof of the editorial. Balthazar walked home with Marcel, a somewhat silent and miserable little journey. In vain he assured her that she had been Godfrey's salvation. She only realized that the boy's faith in her had gone. Of the extent of the salvation he, like Godfrey, said nothing. The position for the moment was too delicate and grotesque to be told to another person, even to Marcel, and his forthrightness scorned half-confidences. He walked back disappointed, ever so little depressed. Hadn't he told everybody to put their trust in him and worry their heads no more about the matter? And they were worrying considerably. At the end of the passage beyond the hall, he saw a streak of light signifying that Godfrey's door was ajar. He went down, opened the door, and looked in. There was Godfrey, huddled up on the Chesterfield, his head in his hands, his fingers clutching his crisp fair hair. As he seemed unaware of intrusion, Balthazar closed the door quietly and tiptoed away. No one knew better than he that every man must go through his little Gethsemane alone. But the pity of it! He crept upstairs with an aching heart. Papers by the last post in connection with the new ministry lay on his desk. He sat down and tried to deal with them, but at last abandoned them and sucked a gloomy pipe. Had he saved the boy after all? Would the woman hold her tongue? Was Donnithorpe such a fool as to believe his story? Meanwhile, he was the avowed lover of the detested woman and the betrayer of official secrets, and the vindictive little rat held the proofs. What use was he going to make of them? Yet the situation had a grimly humorous aspect. If he had not seen the boy huddled up in grief and shame downstairs, he would have envisaged it with one of his great laughs. The next day passed quietly. Godfrey was absent till the evening. He had been to the War Office and arranged to leave for France on the morrow by the staff train. An agreeable evening was marred by no reference to Lady Edna or the scrap of paper. They spoke of books and mathematics and the war and the probable scope of Godfrey's duties. Only when they shook hands for the night did Godfrey say, "I think, sir, you're the best father that ever a man had." And Balthazar, with gladness leaping into his eyes and a grin on his face, replied, "God knows I try to be." On the following morning the post brought him a letter from Donnithorpe's solicitors. Would Mr. Balthazar make an appointment to meet Mr. Donnithorpe and themselves at his earliest convenience on a matter of very serious importance? He bade Quong Ho ring up and fix an appointment for 3 o'clock that afternoon. "Will you not," hazarded Quong Ho, "be also accompanied by your solicitor?" "No," said Balthazar in his grand self-confidence. "Damn lawyers." When the long train moved out of Charing Cross Station amid the waving of handkerchiefs and hats, he drew a breath of unutterable relief. As far as God would allow, the boy was safe. Safe at any rate from the woman with whom he had pledged his honour not to communicate while he was in France. And the boy would keep his word. He had been disentangled from the imbroglio. It was all that mattered. He made his powerful, almost ruthless way through the sobered crowd of lately cheerful friends, seeing off those dear to them, almost heedless of the streaming eyes of women who but a moment ago had been so brave and smiling. He was unique among them. His son was not seeking, but escaping death. Jubilant, he walked across the station yard, up Cockspur Street and Pall Mall. He felt strong, nay more, all-powerful. A force before which all the rats of Donnithorpes and lawyers in the world must crumble. He had no plan, no idea how he should counter Donnithorpe's machinations. He had been accustomed all his life long to wait for the perilous moment and then get in his grip. He had glorious faith in his destiny, his and Godfrey's, the destiny of the house of Baltazar. The war over, Godfrey would find some sweet English girl and marry her, and there would be a son to carry on the torch and hand it, in his turn, to the next generation. Striding up St. James's Street, he saw the babe, made calculations of dates. He would last at least till 75. The grandson then would be on the verge of manhood. He laughed. Odd that he should have lived for 50 years before dreaming of the continuance of his race. Those infernal years in China. He cursed them. Never mind. If he had gone on in the humdrum certainty of the perpetuation of his name, he would have missed the present glory of the conception. It was a wonderful world. He lunched at his club with Weatherly and Burtonshaw, optimistic to Gasconade, prophesying the speedy end of the war. Then the millennium, the world ruled by Anglo-Saxon fibre of brain and body inspired by Latin nervous force, the combination towards which civilization had been groping for centuries. At 10 minutes to 3 he waved them farewell and drove in a taxi to his appointment in Bedford Row. He was shown into a room where Edgar Donnithorpe and an impassive elderly man with a face like a horse awaited him. He felt that he entered like an irresistible force. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. He stood, an hour later, on the pavement of that noiseless and forlorn thoroughfare, and stared at the latest catastrophe, which, like all the others in his impulsive life, he had of his own deliberate act contrived. As yet he failed fully to understand his defeat, for defeat it was, surrender absolute and unconditional. He thrust his hat to the back of his head and mopped his forehead, and moved slowly up the street in a mazed reaction from the glow of conquest which warmed him as he had entered the office. He had gone without any plan of campaign, confident in his intellectual resource to meet emergency. Merciless craft and cunning vindictiveness met him. Under the fierce sunshine, angry shame made him hotter, and the sweat poured down his face. He had been able only to bluster and threaten in vain retaliation. The grey rat of a man had laughed at him with rasping thinness. The horse-faced lawyer had smiled professional deprecation of heroics. "I shall do this and that," he declared. "Then our action will be so and so," they countered. Like the Duke of Wellington, he cried, "Publish and be damned." They pointed out with icy logic that not they, but he and his, would suffer inevitable condemnation. "You and yours," that was the lawyer's phrase. On the last word, two pairs of eyes were bent on him narrowly and significantly. The unmistakable hint, the only one during the interview, of Godfrey's complicity, he had repudiated with indignation. The consequences concerned himself alone. They smiled again. "Let it be so, then," said they, "for the sake of argument." As he walked along the burning street, he wondered how much they knew, how much they guessed. Save for that significant glance, both the grey politician and the long-lipped lawyer had been as inscrutable as Buddhist idols. And he, John Balthazar, had been hopelessly outmatched. Yet after all, at a cost, he had won the game. Godfrey was saved. Mechanically he put his hand to the breast pocket of his thin summer jacket and felt the incriminating document crackle beneath his touch. That, and the sheet of clotted passion of which he had confessed himself the author. He continued his way westwards, down the mean and noisy Theobald's Road, half conscious of his surroundings. The drab men and women who jostled him on the pavement and passed him in the roadway traffic seemed the happy creatures of a dream, happy in the inalienable possession of their London heritage. Fragments of the recent interview passed through his mind. His adversaries had threatened not to stand alone on the written disclosure of War Office secrets. They could bring evidence of leakage through Lady Edna for some time past of important military information. He could quite believe it. The written paper could scarcely be the boy's sole infatuated indiscretion. And as for the lady, revealed as she was yesterday, he counted her capable of any betrayal. Bluff or not, he had yielded to the threat. While the paper remained in Donnithorpe's possession, Godfrey was in grave peril. "You and yours." The phrase haunted him. If he defied them, they would strike through him at Godfrey. Were they aware of farce? If so, why, save for this veiled illusion, did Godfrey, the real lover, seem to matter so little? During the interview their attitude puzzled him, until he became aware of Donnithorpe's implacable enmity towards him, John Balthazar. And now he wondered whether the pose of the injured husband were not a blind for revenge rooted in deeper motives. Only a fortnight or so ago Godfrey had said, "The little beast hates you like poison." He had asked why. Parrot-like, Godfrey had quoted from Lady Edna's report of the conversation between his father's visit to Milsford. "A Triton like you gives these political minnows the jumps." He had laughed at the affected exaggeration. But was the boy right after all? Certainly he had paid scant courtesy to Donnithorpe, whom he had lustily despised as one of the brood of little folk still parasitically feeding on the empire which they had done their best to bring to ruin. Was this the abominable little insect's vengeance? He halted at the hurrying estuary of Hart Street, Bloomsbury, took off his hat, and again mopped his forehead and the short thatch of thick brown hair. The words of Dr. Roosby of Water End flashed across his mind. "Have you generally conducted your life on these extravagant principles?" And, "I should say you were cultivating a very bad habit, and I should advise you to give it up." And he remembered his confession, a year ago, to the sagacious doctor. "You have the most comforting way in the world of telling me that I am the great ass of the universe." That man's diagnosis, said Balthazar to himself, putting on his hat, was perfectly correct. I am. He marched in his unconsciously hectoring way down Holborn and Oxford Street, deep in his thoughts. Yes, once again his episodical life-history had repeated itself. The same old extravagant principles had once again prevailed. They were part and parcel of his being, resistless as destiny. Once again, without thought of the future, he cast the glowing present to the winds. Once again he proved himself the great ass of the universe. But what did it matter? Godfrey was saved. Again he made the papers crackle in his pocket. He had told him he would give his life for him. He strode along fiercely. By God, stupendous ass that he might be, he had never in his life broken a vow or a promise. Apart from the passionate love he had conceived for the boy, there was no reparation adequate for his 20 years' unconscious neglect. He swung his stick to the peril of the king's lieges on the pavement. It was a young man's world, this new world that was to follow the war. Old men like himself were of brief account. Godfrey should have his chance, unstained, unfettered, in the new world which his generation, throwing mildewed tradition on a universal bonfire, would have to mould. He drew nearer to the brighter life of West End London, Oxford Circus, with its proud sweep of great shops and its plentiful harbours from the streams of the 4 great thoroughfares. Reluctant to confine himself yet awhile within the 4 walls of his library, he abandoned the straight course home and went down Regent Street, and at last stood uncertain at Piccadilly Circus, the centre of London, more than any other spot perhaps, the true heart of the empire. Though it was the broad day of a summer afternoon, his memory sped swiftly back over 20 years to the night when he saw it alive with light and flashing movement and the great city's joy of life, for the last time before he sailed for China, when in spite of decorous and scholarly living, his heart had sunk within him at the realization that he was giving up all that, and all that it symbolized, the familiar and pulsating life of England. And now he stood in the same glamour-haunted precincts, and again his heart sank like a stone. He turned, crept for a few steps down Piccadilly, and catching a taxi putting down a fare at the Piccadilly Hotel, engaged it, and drove home to Sussex Gardens. The house appeared bleak and desolate. Quong Ho had gone somewhither. Godfrey, he thanked God, was on his way to France. Foolishly he had hoped that Marcel might be awaiting him to hear the latest tidings of the boy, but she was not there. For all its carpeting and pleasant luxury of furniture, the house seemed to be full of echoes, as though it were an empty shell. For the first time in his life he shrank almost afraid from the intolerable loneliness of the lot to which he had condemned himself. For the last year he had given way to his long pent-up craving for human affection. He had cast his soul into the orgy of love that he had compelled from the only 3 dear to him in the world. It had been more than his daily bread. It had been a kind of daily debauch. It had lifted him above himself. Marcel loved him, Godfrey loved him, Quong Ho loved him, each in their separate ways. They were always there, ready at hand to appease the hunger of the moment. And now, in a flash, he cut himself adrift from the beloved 3. The love would remain, that he knew, but from the precious food of its daily manifestations he would be many thousands of leagues sundered by oceans and continents. At 30 he could forsake love and face solitude with a brave fool's confidence. At 50 he gazed terrified at the prospect. He had embraced loneliness as a bride 3 years ago in order to save himself from perdition. But then his heart had been stone cold, unwarmed by any human touch. He had felt himself to be an unwanted wanderer in an alien planet. Spendale Farm had been a haven of comfort, an Eden of refuge. But the German bomb had revolutionized his world. It had magically brought him into indissoluble bondage to human things of unutterable dearness. And now, once more, fini to the episode which he thought to be the story, ending only in death. He sat mechanically at the writing table in his library, and began to open the letters that had come during his absence. A leathern government dispatch case contained the day's papers from the office, which he had only hurriedly visited that morning, awaited his attention. The deathly sensation that they no longer concerned him held him in a cold grip. There was a flaming article from a Croatian statesman, which had reached the new universe through devious channels, fraught with pregnant information. He glanced through it in impotent detachment, like that of a man brought back to the conduct of his affairs. He was no longer the dynamo of the new universe. Other forces, who and what he knew not, would in a day or 2 take his place. The new universe would have to get on as best it could without him. He was dead. He had no more to do with the new universe than with the internal affairs of Mars. He opened an envelope addressed in a well-known handwriting and franked with distinguished initials. It had been delivered by messenger. Like a dead man, he read the achievement of his ambition. He was a minister of the Crown. The public announcement awaited only his formal acceptance. He stared dully at the idle words. And then suddenly mad rage against the derisive irony of his destiny shook him, and he sprang from his chair, and in the unsympathetic privacy of the room which he had not furnished, he stormed in foolish fury and vain agony of soul. It was the end of John Balthazar, the John Balthazar in whom he had always believed, at the moment of proof positive of the justification of his faith. To Godfrey he had not boasted unduly. A year ago he had awakened a new Rip Van Winkle to a world for 2 years at war. In a few months, God knows how, save through his relentless energy, his newborn and flaming patriotism and his keen brain, he had established himself in England as a driving force compelling recognition and application to the country's needs. He had won his position by sheer strength of personality. Transcendental mathematics and Chinese scholarship he had thrown into the dust heap of broken toys. He had emerged from philosophic childhood into the active life of a man, with his strong hands fingering the strings of the world's war. Now the strings were in his grasp. He had looked far ahead. This ministry, though of vast importance, was yet subordinate to the greater powers of the state. He was young. What was 51? The infancy state of statesmanship. Why should not he, John Balthazar, rise to higher power and guide the civilized world to victory and to triumphant peace? The man had dreamed many dreams. What great man does not? Never yet has the human being whose day's vision is blackened by the curtain of the night reached the shadow of achievement. Then again, was it of England or of John Balthazar that he dreamed? Who can tell? Can any man of noble ambitions, of deep conviction of his own powers, strip himself naked before his God and tell? And now the dreams were but dreams. Blankness confronted him. Raving against fate brought no consolation or relief. In utter dejection he threw himself into an armchair and once more gazed hopelessly at catastrophe. There was no longer a John Balthazar. As far as England was concerned, he had ceased to exist. In that lawyer's office he had signed his abdication. There was the letter written and addressed, formally declining the almost hourly expected offer of the ministerial appointment. The offer had now come. He had pledged his honour to give immediate signal for the posting of the answer. That was part of the price demanded for the surrender of the disastrous documents. He went to the telephone and curtly carried out those terms of his contract. There remained the other condition to be fulfilled, for which they had no other guarantee than his word. There at least, and a gleam of pride irradiated his doom, he had triumphed. He had compelled them to trust his word without a scrap of written obligation. He would sail for China within a month. He sat there alone in the silent house, wondering again whether he had not set the final seal on himself as the great ass of the universe. He had been driven, it is true, into a corner by the malignity and craft of his opponents, but it was he who had dictated the terms of surrender. Acting on one of the wild impulses that had deflected from childhood the currents of his life, he had made the amazing proposal. It was the end of John Balthazar. He rose, went over to his table and filled his pipe. Anyhow, the house of Balthazar stood firm in honour. He would yet dandle the grandson on his knee. La course du flambeau was the beginning and end of human endeavour. The torch was in Godfrey's hands now. Feeling for his matchbox, his wrist met the hidden papers in his jacket pocket which he had almost forgotten. He drew them out, folded the one fraught with court-martial and disgrace to Godfrey into a long strip, and set fire to it, a torch not to be handed on. He lit his pipe with it instead, and watched it burn till the flame touched his fingertips. Then he went over to the grate and burned the love letter. He sat down and wrote to Godfrey. My dear boy, I think you ought to know that I have been as good as my word. 3 hours after parting from you, I recover possession of the document, and this time you may be certain that it no longer exists, for I have myself destroyed it. Your sheet now is clean in this respect, and also in others, if the barrage of silence is maintained. I cannot possibly tell you how I shall miss you. Your ever affectionate father, John Baltazar. That was all. Time enough to tell him about China when he had made definite arrangements for the voyage. He prayed anxiously that he might make the announcement in such a way that Godfrey should never self-reproachfully suspect the cause of his exile. Quong Ho, returning a short while afterwards, found him deeply engaged with the contents of the dispatch case. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 25. As he had expected, the Foreign Office beamed on him. It was immensely gratified that a man of his statesmanlike qualities should have differentiated so acutely between the values of the two spheres of his suggested activities. In bureaucratic satisfaction it rubbed its hands at a departmental score. Mr. Balthazar had only to name his terms and conditions. With the Foreign Office it was all plain sailing, nay, more. If he could have prevailed with an ultra-conservative Admiralty, he would have sent him out to China in the newest, fastest, and most mysterious battle-cruiser. But in government circles outside the Foreign Office there was the devil to pay. Consternation also reigned in the office of the New Universe. For 2 or 3 weeks Balthazar had a grim time. The first announcement in an evening newspaper of his retirement from the projected ministry smote the eyes of an incredulous and bewildered Marcel. She caught him on the telephone. "Is it true?" "Yes, quite true." "But I don't understand." "I'll come round this evening and explain." "No, I'll come to you. I shan't be alone here." "Come to dinner." "Miss Graham and I are just sitting down to ours. I'll run round after." "All right, I'm free all the evening." Balthazar dined alone with Quong Ho and talked cheerfully of matters far remote from the war. No reference was made to his retirement from English politics, about which Quong Ho knew everything, or to the Chinese mission, of which Quong Ho as yet had no official knowledge. Apart from the expressed desire of the Foreign Office to keep the appointment from the press, it was characteristic of Balthazar to maintain silence, even to those dear to him, as to his especially meteoric doings. Besides, of the two, Marcel must have the privilege of being the first to learn from his own lips. She arrived about 8:30, and he received her in the drawing-room. She wore a simple, semi-evening old black dress into which she had changed before her quiet dinner with her friend, a long pre-war confection, a favourite of Godfrey's, moulding her, as he said, in soldierly daring, like Juno. Her thick brown hair crowned her gloriously. Rest had restored her to health, and in spite of the anxiety in her eyes, she appeared to Balthazar in the ripe fullness of her beauty. He strode to meet her with his usual gesture of outstretched hands, strong, confident, admiring, smiling. Yet never did she appear more desirable or more remote from his desires. "What is the meaning of it, your resignation? I thought it was the one thing in life you were working for." "I find," said he, "I can serve my country better in other ways." She put her hand to a puzzled forehead. "How?" He looked steadily into her eyes. What was the use of beating the air with idle words? She would have to know the truth sooner or later. "By going to China." She stared at him open-mouthed. "China?" "Why not?" He stood, his hands deep in his dinner jacket pockets, balancing himself alternately on toes and heels, with the air of a conqueror. "I know more about inner China, I suppose, than any man living. I go out with a free hand to pull 2 or 3 million people together and establish a wise government and exterminate the German. Hundreds of men can do my job in England, but those who can do it in China may be counted on the fingers of a mutilated hand." "It's all so sudden." "I'm a sudden sort of fellow, as you ought to know," he laughed. "But you always said you hated the place, would rather die than go back." "In these days you've got to do things you hate for the good of your country." She sat down, feeling stupefied by his news. She asked, "How long will you be away?" He shrugged his shoulders. "Possibly years. Who knows?" And when do you start? As soon as I can wind up here, say in a fortnight's time. She shook her head and looked at the floor, making little hopeless gestures with her fingers. You see, my dear, said he, except my own personal ambitions, which I have scrapped for the time, there's nothing very much to keep me here. I've done my duty by Quong Ho. He's on the road to fame at Cambridge. Godfrey's settled in France till the end of the war. And you? Well, my dear, he smiled, we won't lose touch with each other for another 20 years. No, of course not, she said in a queer voice. We'll write to each other. She raised her eyes to his timidly. Won't you be rather lonely out there, without us? He turned swiftly aside so that she should not see his face. Naturally I'll miss you, miss the three of you. I'm human, but on the other hand I'm used to being alone. I'm a solitary by temperament. Then he flashed round on her. Don't you worry about me. I'll have my hands too full to be lonely. I'll have a real man's job to get through. In his vehement way he sketched the kind of work that lay before him, went off into picturesque reminiscence, unfolded some of the plans he had already made for the conquest of those in power in disaffected districts. Anyone but Marcel he would have convinced of the whole-hearted and enthusiastic anticipation of his mission. But a woman whom a man loves is apt to know him even better than the woman who loves him. A suspicion, vague but insistent, began to haunt her. Presently she gave words to it. Have Godfrey's affairs anything to do with this sudden decision of yours? He assumed a puzzled look. Godfrey's affairs? Yes, the Donnithorpe business. He laughed. My dear, we're dealing in high international politics. What on earth can a boy's calf love have to do with it? You never told me what happened to Waterloo, nor did Godfrey. I simply pulled them apart, sent Lady Edna home, and dispatched Godfrey to France a day before his time. That's all over. But you met Mr. Donnithorpe. Quong Ho. Oh, yes, I met Donnithorpe. That's what saved the situation. He expected to find Godfrey, found me instead. He grinned in the most disarming manner. A comedy situation, and off he went defeated. He took her hand, apparently in the gayest of moods. It's only a woman, said he, that could throw a bridge between Waterloo Station and the interior of China. She let the question drop, but the suspicion remained, and every minute that passed, until the ormolu clock on the drawing-room mantelpiece gave her the signal for conventional retirement, converted it into certainty. He walked with her as usual to the door of her block of flats. On parting she found tremulous utterance for the sense of utter forlornness which she had been trying all the evening to formulate. What's to become of me when you're gone? She fled upstairs, not waiting for the lift, and went straight to her room with the words echoing in her ears. No, they did not at all convey her heart's meaning. They sounded heartless, selfish. Yet they were true. What would become of her? For a year she had been enwrapped soul and mind and thought in the dynamic man. Dynamic, yet so tender, so chivalrous, so childlike. Without him existence was a blank full of shuddering fears. And then a coldness as of death fell upon her. Never once, on this night of the parting of the ways, had he hinted at his love for her. Had she, by her selfish folly, her now incomprehensible sex shrinkings, killed at last the love that once was hers for the taking? Slowly she undressed and crept into bed, but sleep mocked her. Agonizingly awake, she stared at her life. And she stared, too, almost in rhythmic alternation, at the life of John Baltazar. Nothing but some supreme emotional crisis could have caused this characteristic revolution, this sudden surrender of the prize of his ambition, this gorgeous acceptance of exile. For all his contemptuous dismissal of the suggestion, she knew, with a woman's unerring logic, that Balthazar had bought Godfrey's release from entanglement at the price of his own career. And never a hint of regret, never a murmur against fate, never the faintest appeal to pity. And she arraigned her own narrow nurse's self and condemned it mercilessly. And the lower she sank in her own esteem, the higher rose Balthazar, until he loomed gigantic as a god above her puny mortality. Her throat was dry. She got out of bed and drank a glass of water. On her way back across the room, her glance fell on the little brass Yale latchkey lying on her dressing-table, which he, in his big, careless way, had insisted on her having, so that she could gain entrance as of right to the house whenever she chose. She took it up, gazing at it stupidly. The key to his home, the key to his heart, the key to his soul, all in her keeping. And she had despised it. Now she had lost it. The home would pass into alien hands. His heart was barred. For the first time for a whole year they had met without his uttering one little word, playful or wistful or tyrannic, to prove that his nature was open hungrily for her. Tonight she had been but his dear friend. He had accepted her gift of friendship. She remembered the old French adage, "L'amitié, c'est le tombeau de l'amour." She sat on the edge of the bed and mourned hopelessly the death of his love. And the brass Yale latchkey lay mockingly within her range of vision. Balthazar walked home, her last words echoing in his ears. His absence in China would naturally make a difference to her. She had become part of his household. Godfrey, to whom she had given a mother's heart, was indefinitely in France and alienated from her by his resentment of her breach of confidence. She had identified herself so unreservedly with the fortunes of the house of Balthazar that now, cut adrift, she would be on the high seas, derelict. What could he do to mitigate her loneliness? If he died, she would be well provided for. He had made his will some months ago. But he had every hope of living for many robust years. What indeed would become of the beloved woman now that their new attachments to life were broken? The nurse's career, in which she had spent the splendid energies of her young womanhood? If Godfrey were in London, he could commend her with authority to his care. But Godfrey's vanishing to France was the essence of the whole business. There remained only Quong Ho. His appreciation of the comic put Quong Ho out of court. He entered his house in Sussex Gardens, remorseful for lack of consideration for Marcel. But hang it all, one couldn't think of everything at once. If she had cared enough for him to marry him, well, there would have been the light that never was on sea or land. He would have snapped his fingers at the doings of the little planet Earth. He would have been master of the universe. But that was not to be. Either all in all as a wife, or not at all. An irrevocable decision. It was not Marcel's fault that she did not love him in that way. No use thinking of it. It was all over. They had drifted, however, into an exquisite companionship, as exquisite to her, he had no false modesty about it, as to him. And now that was over. What was to become of Marcel? He was filling his pipe when Quong Ho entered the library with his little deferential bow. "Sir," said he, "may I be allowed to commit an indiscretion?" "You'll do it so discreetly," said Balthazar, "that it won't matter. Fire ahead." "In the event of your leaving this country on a mission to the Far East—" "What the devil do you know about it?" asked Balthazar. "In high Chinese circles in London it is common knowledge," replied Quong Ho. "Together with lots of other things concerning me, I suppose." "You have many times observed," said Quong Ho, "that my countrymen are afflicted with an abnormal thirst for unessential information." In spite of his heavy-heartedness, Balthazar smiled grimly. "Well, suppose I am going to China. What of it? May I postpone Cambridge degree and fellowship for several years and accompany you?" Balthazar's brow grew black. "Isn't England good enough for you?" Quong Ho broke into florid Chinese, the only vehicle for his emotion. England was the land of his dreams, but why should he lie beneath the passion-flower of luxury while his master ate the bread of exile? Surely his degraded unworthiness might be useful to his illustrious excellency as confidential secretary, not unversed, thanks to his honoured master and patron, in the language and scholarship of the mandarins. Or, if that was deemed too honourable a position, his filial piety ordained that he should offer himself as slave or any debased instrument for which use could be found. "Oh, for God's sake, talk English!" cried Balthazar, his nerves on edge, foreseeing such endless verbiage and similar perfect phrasing that awaited him in China. Quong Ho spread out his hands, and his face grew impassive. "I have spoken," he replied simply. "I don't want any more careers upset," said Balthazar irritably. "You're fixed. You're to get your fellowship. You'll stay in England. Besides, I need you here to look after Miss Baring's interests." "I confess," said Quong Ho gravely, "to being oblivious of that side of the question." Balthazar, lying deep in his armchair, pipe in mouth, gazed intently into the oblique, steadfast eyes of the son of his quaint adoption. The idea of leaving Marcel under his protection did not seem in the least comic. He passed an impatient hand over his brow. Was he losing his sense of values? Apart from his intellectual gifts, Quong Ho was a man of shrewd common sense and of infinite trustworthiness. Marcel knew this. Unlike so many untravelled Englishwomen, she did not regard a Chinaman as a sort of dangerous toy dog. She shared his faith in Quong Ho. "I thank you for your offer, my dear fellow," he said at last, repenting his ungraciousness. "I know you made it out of affection for me. I deeply appreciate it. If it weren't for Miss Baring, I wouldn't hesitate. As it is, I leave you here as my agent." Quong Ho bowed. "So long as I can be of service to you, sir, your word is law," said he, and retired. Balthazar, left alone, resumed his uninspired reflections. He felt physically and morally weary, a beaten man. He shrank from his Chinese exile with pathetic dread, shrank from the toilsome journeys, the eternal compliments of convention that delayed serious discussion, the perpetual ceremonial, the futile tea-drinking, the mass of tradition and prejudice and ignorance, the smiling craft that used it as a buffer against enlightenment. He looked with dismay on his exclusion from the keen intellectual talk in which he had revelled for the past year, from the brain-thrilling battle of Western thought. It was a man's work, his mission, a picked man's work. Hundreds would have regarded it as a climax of their diplomatic ambition. But to him, who had thrown himself into vast schemes for the reconstruction of the war-torn world, it was exile, defeat. It was not in his nature to regret his sacrifice. What was done was done. The stars in their courses have fought against him individually, even though in their inscrutable wisdom they fought, as he believed, for his house. No man who has saturated himself for years with Chinese thought can escape the spiritual influence of fatalism. He was a fatalist. It was written that he should fail in every one of his great adventures. Yet the fact of it being written made his lot none the less damnable for the very human and vivid man once more involved in predestined shipwreck. He smoked many pipes, thinking disconnectedly, without method, and feeling old and lonely and broken, and very, very tired. At last his pipe dropped to the floor, and he fell asleep. Suddenly, the subconsciousness of a presence in the room caused him to awake with a start. He looked up, and, bewildered, saw Marcel standing by his chair. She was crying. He sprang to his feet, passing his hands over his eyes. "You here?" His glance instinctively sought the clock on the mantelpiece. "Why, it's 2:30 in the morning." She said, "I couldn't sleep. I couldn't rest. I had to come." He did not understand. "What is the matter, my dearest? What can I do for you?" "Only go on loving me and forgive me," she said desperately. "But I do," he cried, puzzled. "It's just hell for me to leave you. But I can't help it, my dear. My hand has been forced. It's even harder to leave you than it was 20 years ago. I love you and want you more than ever I did in my life." "So do I," she said in a shaking voice. "That's why I'm here at 2:30 in the morning." Balthazar uttered a great triumphant cry and clasped her in his arms. "My God," said he, "I've won after all." He held her at arm's length and looked at her exultantly. Thank heaven she had no suspicion of his sense of downfall. Not pity, but love at last awakened, had brought her to him. "Yes," he repeated, "I've won after all." After a while, when he had almost forgotten his words, she asked him, "What did you think you had lost?" "My faith in my destiny, the star of Baltazar. Once upon a time, the original bearer of my name, with the others, had faith in a star, and he followed it and found God." She smiled. "Dear, aren't you talking a bit wildly?" "What's the good of speech if one can't use it wildly in wild moments?" He laughed. "Oh, you belovedest woman," said he, and kissed her. Presently, "You'll come out to China with me?" You'll progress like a queen, I'll see to that. It doesn't matter how I progress, she said, so long as I'm with you. I'm yours, body and soul, to the end of time. To the end of eternity, he cried. I prefer that. It's bigger. The biggest there is good enough for me. His dancing eyes burned like flames of pride and happiness. 20 years seemed to have fallen from him, and she saw before her the young man whom as a girl she had loved. You and I are going over to the greatest work ever attempted by man, the regeneration of half the continent of Asia. I couldn't have done it alone. The prospect frightened me. Yes, it did. I hadn't the heart. But with you, I stake my faith in the star. It'll be one of the great accomplishments of the war. Quong Ho will come with us. He'll have his chance. I'll make him one of the great men of the new China. He went on, expounding his vision of the new order of Oriental things. She marvelled at him, for it seemed as if he had but lived for that moment. And, divining his great sacrifice, she forgot the selfless years that had all but moulded her into a mere machine of tender service to maimed and diseased humanity, and felt a thing of small account before this man whose unconquerable faith and indomitable courage transformed his colossal vanities into virtues, and who, for all his egotism, was endowed with the supreme gift of love. Godfrey will be astonished at all this, she hazarded. Astonishment, said he, is an emotion salutary for the very young. It stimulates thought. End of chapter 25. End of The House of Baltazar by William John Locke.